Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your not-so-daily dose of the latest news, rumours and speculation about the Lord of the Rings of Power. The day is Tuesday, July 16th, and I'm your host Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. I realise this episode might be dropping into your feeds, and you'll be saying, Harry, I haven't even finished listening to the last 4-hour episode you put out last week, and for that, I sort of apologise, but it cannot really be a sincere apology, because I'm delighted we're back to regular episodes that are full to the brim of exciting news about Season 2 of the Rings of Power. As you may remember last week, we published the episode covering all the previous news only to find that on that same Monday, Amazon decided to fire out another dozen articles. And across the course of last week, we got so much more, including the most important reveal of all. That reveal, of course, being the main man, Círdan, is here. That's right, last week we finally got our first look at Círdan the Shipwright, played by Ben Daniels, and I couldn't have been more excited to talk about him. In this episode, we'll cover the big news about everyone's favourite 10,000-year-old shipbuilder, and I guess, yearner-in-chief, as well as the many other articles about Season 2's production, including lots of juicy new pictures to talk about. Once again, this is another long walk to Mordor of an episode, as Anna and I once again discovered that we really don't know what it means to be brief. But before we start our big adventure down the long trail of news, we of course cannot begin an episode without a reading from the Professor's work. Today, our reading comes from The Peoples of Middle-earth, Part 2, Last Writings, of Glorfindel, Círdan, and other matters. It was during the long waiting of the Teleri for the return of the floating isle, upon which the Vanyar and Noldor had been transported over the Great Sea, that Círdan had turned his thoughts and skill to the making of ships, for he and all the other Teleri became impatient. Nonetheless, it is said that for the love of his kin and allegiance, Círdan was the leader of those who sought longest for Elwë when he was lost and did not come to the shores to depart from Middle-earth. Thus he forfeited the fulfilment of his greatest desire, to see the blessed realm and find again there Olwë and his own nearest kin. Alas, he did not reach the shores until nearly all the Teleri of Olwë's following had departed. Then, it is said, he stood forlorn, looking out to sea, and it was night, but far away he could see a glimmer of light upon Eressëa, ere it vanished into the west. Then he cried aloud, I will follow that light, alone if none will come with me, for the ship that I have been building is now almost ready. But even as he said this, he received in his heart a message which he knew to come from the Valar, though in his mind it was remembered as a voice speaking in his own tongue. And the voice warned him not to attempt this peril, for his strength and skill would not be able to build any ship able to dare the winds and waves of the great sea for many long years yet. Abide now that time, for when it comes then will your work be of utmost worth, and it will be remembered in song for many ages after. Aye, obey, Círdan answered, and then it seemed to him that he saw, in a vision maybe, a shape like a white boat, shining above him, that sailed west through the air, and as it dwindled in the distance, it looked like a star of so great a brilliance, that it cast a shadow of Círdan upon the strand where he stood. Once again, I highly doubt you need an explanation why I chose this reading. Not only is it a rare delight to read from one of the volumes of the history of Middle-earth, more importantly, it is one of Tolkien's most beautiful pieces of writing, about one of my favourite characters. Now I hope you were able to bear with me as I did my best to pronounce Círdan correctly. As you'll see in my conversation with Anna, we get a little bit more English and a little bit more relaxed. So if you hear us calling him Círdan, then don't worry too much about it. We know we're not nailing the pronunciation, but as we say, we'll wait for the show to tell us just the right way to say it. And with that out the way, I don't want to waste a single more moment before talking about the great elf himself. So let's dive into our conversation with Anna. So, after just a week off, usually it's taken us much longer to get to these episodes, and in my defense, it's probably at times taken me 3 months or 6 months, but now we're back into the swing of things. We have articles coming every week, we have news, we've got Comic-Con coming back soon, and so with that, obviously last week we did an episode talking about all the Empire news and everything in that, and the day we published that, we ended up with about 10 more articles, and over the course of this week we've had even more news, including one big character reveal. And so, of course, to go through all this, I have once again welcomed back my wonderful, let's go with that adjective, wonderful co-host, Anna. Anna, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Thank you for having me back. I'm very good, if not slightly overwhelmed by just the amount of content we got in kind of 1-2 days. The Rings of Power marketing team do like to do this thing where they have a period of just complete and total silence, and then out of the blue, we'll just be kind of completely bombarded with news. But I'm not complaining because everything that we've heard in the past few days has been wonderful and filled me with a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I think it's been a week where all the news that has come out has encouraged me. Now, as we'll get into, there are some storylines where I'm still waiting for some more news, still waiting to hear about a bit more about what they've got planned. But I will say, considering the dozen or so articles I've read through this week, and believe me, that was a challenge in itself, I am very encouraged, and I'm excited for what's to come. I'm excited for what we're going to see at Comic-Con. Obviously, we'll most likely get a trailer on the 26th, the day of the Rings of Power panel, so we'll be back to cover that. But even across, the week and a half we've got before Comic-Con, it'll be interesting to see whether we get any more character reveals, whether we get more interviews. I suspect we will, and maybe even another teaser to get us ready for Comic-Con. So lots to be excited about, and we're going to try and cover everything that happened last week. So everything from last Monday, which was, I think, the 8th, all the way up to this weekend of the 13th. So a lot of articles to get through. But of course, we can only start in one place. And it's not the first piece of news we got this week. It wasn't even the second or the third, but it was the most important piece. And that was, on July 11th, we got the reveal from IGN that none other than Ben Daniels will be playing Círdan the Shipwright in Season 2. Now, everyone knows this is a character I'm very excited about, one of my favourite characters from the books that realistically doesn't get much quote-unquote screen time, nor a lot of dialogue, but someone that I am incredibly excited about. And I'm going to get Anna's instant reaction to the news shortly, but just for those of you who are perhaps not familiar with Ben Daniels, I just wanted to give a bit of a brief intro into him. So Daniels is perhaps best known for his roles as Adam Galloway in House of Cards, Father Marcus Keene in The Exorcist, Bel Riose in Foundation second season, and most recently, and I know this is a favourite of my co-host, was of course Santiago in Season 2 of Interview with the Vampire. He's also an acclaimed stage actor. He's been nominated for a whole host of awards and has even won the Laurence Olivier Award for Best Actor in a Supporting Role, which was back in 2001 for his performance in All My Sons. And it says here, according to Anna's notes on the subject, that he is also sexy, hot, and sexy. So with that, Anna, I want to throw it over to you and get your instant reaction. Take us back a few days to Thursday, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday. What was your reaction to seeing the news? And of course, one thing I should say, we got our first picture. And what was your reaction to seeing Ben as Círdan for the first time?
I mean, I think you pretty much just summed up my first reaction to the picture, which was sexy, hot and sexy. But I think this was a casting that we'd been anticipating for a while. I know a lot of people over on Twitter as well had been kind of hoping, praying for a Ben Daniels Círdan, because when you just look at his kind of range in the past and you just look at the picture that's been released of him, he already embodies the character perfectly, I think. And we've not even seen any clips of him, any speech, anything like that. He is Círdan the Shipwright. And this came at a really good time for me, because, as you said, he played Santiago in Interview with the Vampire, which I watched for the first time last week, and it's taken over my life slightly. But if you haven't seen it, I would implore you to go and watch it, if not just for Ben Daniels in season 2, because he's absolutely harrowing, but he's incredible at the same time. And I think he'll bring that same sort of kind of gravitas to Círdan, because it's hard, a character like Círdan, because he's so old. He is one of the oldest elves at this point in time, and you have to kind of get that across, that sort of weariness. And I think he will do that really well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like I said, I've kind of highlighted a few of the roles I've seen him in. I haven't seen him in a lot of his stage work, obviously. I haven't been to the theatre when he's been in anything. But when I think about some of the roles he's played, he is an actor with incredible range, but there's also something at the core of it, which is just the way he's able to do a lot with his facial expressions and his eyes in particular. And I think that's so interesting, because one of the few pieces of description you get for Círdan in the books is that he has eyes keen as stars. It's said that he has this aged appearance. He looks old, noticeably so for an elf. He has a beard, but his eyes are described as keen as stars. And, for anyone who hasn't, feel free to zoom in on any picture of Ben Daniels. And I would say, the Rings of Power casting department really knocked it out. For the extent that any human can have eyes keen as stars, I think Ben gets pretty close. I will also say that before we go any further and start talking about Círdan from the books, I realize that there are going to be people in the audience saying, you're not pronouncing his name correctly. You've got to roll the R. It's got to be more of an E sound on the I. Listen, we're going to be talking for 2 to 3 hours today. You'll have to excuse us if we don't pronounce it exactly correctly, but I will be waiting to see how the actors in the show do it, because I know they've done a very good job with the kind of elvish pronunciation in the show. So once I've heard Rob Aramios say his name, because I think Rob is the gold standard for pronouncing elvish names. So once I've heard Rob Aramios say it, I will then just copy how Rob does it. But you'll have to excuse us if we're a little English in our way of saying Círdan as if his second name is Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, it's just great. And I think that I felt quite vindicated, because I know we talked, I think it might have been the last time we did an episode, we talked about the sort of backlash that people had towards Celebrimbor's casting, because they cast obviously an older actor to play him. And funnily enough, there was a similar sort of reaction to Círdan's kind of casting as Ben Daniels. However, in this case, we had a quote from none other than J.R.R. Tolkien himself, calling him very old and grey, to kind of react to people with. And it was very nice to just see people kind of go, oh, never mind.
Yep. Well, yes, I mean, there's something to be said for the type of people who just criticize the show in a knee-jerk reaction, and in doing so expose their asses in terms of, I'm going to rephrase that because otherwise I can't put it in the show. And in doing so, expose their ignorance of the books, showing that they haven't even read them, because the amount of people saying, why has he got a beard? Why does he look so old? All these things. It's very funny. But let's perhaps, before we even get into what we know about him in the show, let's just talk about this picture of him, because as part of the reveal with IGN, and it's now been posted by the official Rings of Power account, we got this wonderful picture of Círdan, which I'm sure many of you are looking at as we speak, or have been looking at. And in the picture, we see Ben as Círdan standing kind of front and center, wearing what I would almost say is this kind of blue-green, almost... Do you know what I would call it? It's almost like sea foam. It's got that kind of the color of the deep ocean on a stormy day with the waves across it, because it's got these streaks of lighter colors across it. The collar and the sleeves are embroidered with wave patterns, and then he's wearing this sort of leather sash around his waist, which is marked as if it's been worn. And then on his hip, there appears to be some kind of wood carving tool with what looks like a bone handle. And then in the background, background of the shot, we have what is clearly his boathouse. So we've got the hull of a ship being constructed. We've got tables along the side with what we assume are his apprentices working away, carving wood. And it's just, I mean, it's a gorgeous set, and we can talk more about what we know about the Grey Haven set in a moment. But I mean, in terms of this still itself, Anna, what really stands out to you for it, apart from sexy, 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 hot, sexy?
I think the first thing that actually stood out to me was his hair. I really love what they've done with it. And listen, this might be me reading too much into it. However, I do think that kind of the hair and makeup departments are very underrated for the visual storytelling they do. And what you'll see is that I know the Rings of Power have kind of shook things up a bit with the portrayal of elven hair. You know, it's not all long as it had been in the kind of Jackson portrayals.
Yeah.
But when we do get longer hair within the Rings of Power, it tends to just be straight as we saw in the Jackson portrayals. But they've waved his hair, they've waved Círdan's hair here, and it feels like very intricately waved too. And it almost sort of kind of matches the waves embroidered into his clothes. And I think that that's a really nice little detail. Again, I could just be reading too much into that, but that's the first thing that kind of stuck out to me.
Yeah, I think his curls are gorgeous. And the other thing, if you really zoom in on the hair around his sort of neck, you can see that there are still some darker strands of hair there, which I think is a really interesting choice because, of course, Tolkien's description of Círdan in the books largely comes from the very end of Return of the King, when the hobbits arrive at the Grey Havens and they see him. Now, his hair, he would look even older then, because that would be another, depending on where we are in the Second Age, somewhere between probably 4,000 to 5,000 years in the future from when the Rings of Power is taking place. So I like the idea that while he looks old in this, if we saw Ben Daniels as Círdan at the end of Third Age, he would look even more old, and perhaps his hair would be jet white, and he would look even older and more wizened. And so I like the idea that where we're kind of seeing him now is in that kind of process of properly aging. So it's not like they've cast someone who's 80 years old. You know, it's not like they've cast Ian McKellen as he is now as a really old man. They've cast someone who is clearly aged, but not,
Yes.
you know, looking like a wizard from the Third Age, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do like that. And another thing that I quite like is just kind of the simplicity of his clothes. I know that quite a lot of people were expecting him to, as a lord, have this sort of extravagant outfit on, but we can see here that he's in his boathouse. So in my mind, these are kind of working clothes. And I think the simplicity suits a character like Círdan. I've never kind of imagined him as someone who would wear this kind of extravagant get-up at all times, like perhaps Gil-galad would.
Yeah, do you know, I agree with you that I think this outfit, obviously he is working in his boathouse. He is doing crafting and carving while he's in there. So maybe that's reason for the simplicity. But there's also something about Círdan to me. Like, if there was a word I could use to describe Círdan, it would be humility. And I think that idea of him being an incredibly, especially in contrast to Celebrimbor, I think it's important that visually, in terms of the clothes they wear, they should be very distinct. And I've actually said before that I think they should have gone further with Celebrimbor in terms of more bling, more opulence, more extravagance in his clothing. But even if you compare what Círdan is wearing here to Celebrimbor's smithing outfit, his forging outfit we saw in episode 8, in that he's got gold chains and that kind of medallion across his chest. There's, you know, it is still more extravagant than what Círdan is wearing here, even though, you know, Celebrimbor is working with molten metal and doing precious jewel work. Círdan is even more simplified. And I saw someone saying that elves aren't humble, or that, you know, elves aren't modest. And I think that's true in general. You know, we don't think of elves aesthetically as kind of monk-like or minimalist. But I think for a character like Círdan, whose whole life has been about service, both to the Valar and to others, and who at every turn in the story basically puts himself second to others' needs, in a weird way, if they showed him and he was wearing an elaborate bright blue robe with kind of silver detailing, I would have thought, God, Círdan's a bit bougie for a shipwright, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of an elf who ignored his deepest heart's desire for 10,000 years. So I think as you said, the simplicity and the humility just suits him, and it would be strange if he took the Celebrimbor approach, or, like rings on every finger, like gold chains.
Yeah.
It's just not him.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about our initial reaction. Now I want to talk about what do we know about him in the show, and then we'll talk a little bit about what do we know about Círdan in the books, and then finally, before we move on, Anna and I will talk a little bit about how we think the show might use him. So, turning to what we know about him in the show, we got two real pieces of information from, it wasn't from the IGN article actually, it was from the Nerdist article, so separate publication, but did an article and included a bit more context. So we got 2 points. One was the Prime Video description of the character, which is as follows. Círdan the Shipwright is master of the Grey Havens and a font of wisdom even among the High Elves. An expert shipbuilder, Círdan is also the original bearer of Narya, one of the 3 elven rings of power designed by Celebrimbor. He also serves as a mentor to Elrond, and we'll definitely return to that last bit in a second. And then the second part we learned was about the set design of Círdan's boathouse and of the Grey Havens. So this is a quote from Martin Foley, supervising art director. We had an interior set on stage, which was huge and beautiful. Then we had an exterior set on the backlot where, you can see on the model there, we had a part of a bridge which linked it to other islands in the Grey Havens setting. Then we have a tower, a lighthouse tower with a huge bonsai tree wrapping around it. It's nature coming into the architecture because the elves are all about the nature. And then we get an additional note in the article that there was a miniature model of this boathouse which was described as delicate and swooping. So, Anna, whether you want to start with that description of Círdan as a font of wisdom and a mentor to Elrond, or the... Actually, do you know what? I'll give us a bit of direction so we don't get sidetracked, because we'll come on to that description of him. But let's talk about the set, because obviously in the background we can see the interior shot. But what do you make of this description of the Grey Havens as almost linked islands, lighthouses, trees wrapping around the architecture? How do you feel about that?
It sounds incredible. One of the things that you take away, I think, when you watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy is that you spend so little time in the Grey Havens, but it's one of the sets that kind of stands out the most to you. And I'm glad that we're kind of going to see that more in depth this season. I think we'll get onto this a little bit more when we talk about production, but I was a bit wary about the move to the UK at first. And I think a lot of people were, just because our vision of Middle-earth is so kind of entrenched within New Zealand because of the Jackson films. But it feels like that move has given them a lot more scope to just go as big and as bold as they wanted to with these sets. And I think it's going to be all for the better, A place like the Grey Havens, it's the last place a lot of elves see before they leave Middle-earth. So they've got to kind of make it grand. And it's quite a sad place at the same time. So, and it's also kind of a refuge for a lot of elves. So it's got so many things in one place, and I'm very excited to see it on screen. I just, even from the description they've given us, I still can't really picture in my head exactly what it's going to look like. I see it bathed in this sort of orangey yellow glow, but I know that's because of what we've seen from the Jackson film. So I wonder if they're going to go down that same route, or if they're going to go for a completely different sort of view completely.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things, and I know we've talked about this. We probably talked about this when we reacted to season 1 as well. One of the things Rings of Power does is, to an extent, ground some of the locations, make them feel a bit more real than the Peter Jackson films. And partly that's because of the tone of the Second Age, and partly that's just because we're spending more time in these places. For example, Khazad-dûm in season 1 now. Lindon and the Grey Havens in season 2. One of the things that surprised me the most was this idea, and I don't know, obviously it's difficult from a 2-sentence description, but I'd never thought of the Grey Havens as almost kind of an archipelago of islands, and I'm sure it will still be a coastal city as it's meant to be, but I like this idea that Círdan's kind of almost built around the coast and built around the rocks, and it's all kind of interweaving, and so you've got these linked islands, which I'm very excited to see it get. And I think the nice thing about that is, obviously, because in season 1 we had the port at Númenor, which was just kind of a grand port that you sailed into, but it's very much built into the land. And I think maybe the reason they've gone for this design is to distinguish it a little bit, make it look a little bit different. And I love this idea of a huge tree wrapping around the lighthouse tower. As I joked on Twitter, I'd love Círdan's introduction to be him halfway up a ladder with a giant pair of pruning scissors trying to prune his bonsai tree, because I just think that would be nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing we can take away is like no matter what it ends up looking like, it's going to be just incredible. And I like how kind of varied the influences have been for the set designs. I mean, they touched on here about ancient Japanese craftsmanship inspiring the Grey Havens, but further on in a few of the articles, they talk about Númenor being inspired by kind of Roman churches and Romanian churches as well. And just that kind of wider influence is like it's very nice, because there's so many different cultures within Middle Earth, and that's one of the things you have to understand. Just because something is built by the elves doesn't mean that every place looks exactly the same.
Yeah, in fact, in that picture of Círdan, you can kind of see some similarities to the Eregion sets we've seen in terms of the shape of the arches on the doorways. But actually, if you look at things like the lamps, the curve of the ceiling, it's a very, it's almost got that kind of what we, I guess, might think of more as kind of Viking longhouses, where with
Yes.
a kind of more arched ceiling. Weirdly to me, it almost had a church-like quality to it in these images. When I looked at it, maybe it's because of the natural light coming through the windows and the exposed beams. I was really reminded of kind of old chapels that you might see. But I'm just, it looks beautiful to me.
I think that makes sense. Like Círdan's craft is kind of reverent for him. It would make sense for his kind of place of work to be this almost reverent place.
Yeah.
Which is quite a nice detail. I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's turn. I know I said we were going to talk about the Prime Video description of him, but in fact, maybe let's talk about Círdan in the books, because then that will more naturally
We
lead
can
us to
do
talk
that
about
at the end, yeah.
Yeah, talk about how they're going to use him in the show. So I realize a lot of our listeners might not have read the Silmarillion, which is where you're going to find a lot of the information about Círdan. You'll also find more in Unfinished Tales and Histories of Middle-earth. And if anyone has any questions about which specific parts, feel free to drop me a message on Twitter and I can point you to the specific chapters. But here's a kind of brief overview of Círdan's history in the book. So Círdan is, as Anna said, one of the oldest elves. By the time of the end of the Third Age, when Frodo departs Middle-earth, Círdan is somewhere between 10,000 and 11,000 years old. So he is incredibly old by this point in his life, but that is because he's one of the first elves to awake in Middle-earth. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the history, the elves didn't awake in Valinor. Even if you've seen Rings of Power Season 1, you saw them in Valinor. The elves first awoke in Middle-earth, far out into the east, in a place called Cuiviénen. And to do a very short summary of the Silmarillion, the elves basically go on a journey westward, guided by the Valar, and then many of them depart over the sea, going to Valinor, which is almost the land that had been prepared for them, the blessed realm that had been prepared for them by the Valar. Now, a portion of those elves, well, there were many portions, but one portion stayed in Middle-earth. Oh, God, this is so difficult to simplify. Anyway, so the point is that a portion of the elves stayed in Middle-earth, and Círdan was part of one of these groups that stayed in Middle-earth. And he stayed there, in fact, because he went waiting for his king, or one of his kings, because there was technically two, Elwë, who later became Thingol, which some of you might be familiar with from Thingol and Melian. And he waited on the coast, and at one point he wanted to depart. And as you will have heard in that quote I used for the reading at the start of the book, he waited on the shores of Middle-earth, and he looked out, and he had such a great longing to build a ship and travel across the sea to Valinor, because that was his, as it says in the history of Middle-earth, the fulfillment of his greatest desire, to see the blessed realm and find again there Olwë and his own nearest kin, because many of his kin, the Teleri, had already gone across to Valinor. But he receives a vision, or maybe it's a voice. As it says in that passage, it's unclear whether he's hearing it in his own mind or whether it's a real message from the Valar. But he receives this message asking him to basically serve the Valar and abide in Middle-earth and to be there for the moment he is needed, which in essence is, among many other great deeds he does, is the building of Eärendil, Elrond's father, his ship Vingalot, which allowed him to sail to Valinor to seek the help of Valar to then help win the war against Morgoth. And in between all of this, between him being asked to stay and helping Eärendil build his ship, if you haven't read the Silmarillion, the only way I can describe Círdan is he is the one who comes to provide aid. He builds the havens at the Falas. He becomes the lord of the Falathrim, these elves who live on the coastline. At numerous points, he saves other elves who are besieged or in battle. He leads raids against Morgoth's forces up the rivers. He's basically a Viking raider in his boats. He tries to save Elrond's parents during the third kinslaying at the havens. He acts as a foster father to Gil-galad. He raises him. Gil-galad, who'd been orphaned at this point and is in elven terms a boy, Círdan takes him in and raises him. And then into the Second Age, Círdan, once again, he is the one who helps build all the ships to take the Edain, the men who fought with the elves in the war against Morgoth. He builds the ships to take them to Númenor, their prepared land, and he founds the Grey Havens, or Mithlond, and he later befriends the Númenorians when they return to Middle-earth, the most famous example being Aldarion, which you can read about in The Tale of Aldarion and Orendis in Unfinished Tales. Anyway, so I realize I've gone on, but what I'm trying to get across to you, and Anna can probably pick up on where I've left off here, is this idea that Círdan is someone who endures through 3 ages of Middle-earth, technically 4 if you want to count the year of the trees before the first age starts. And all throughout it, the only thing he tries to do is to provide aid, to be a haven to other elves, to rescue other elves, to look after the orphaned and the kinless, to do acts of service both for the elves and for the men. And there is no other way to describe him but just this kind of eternal sentinel. He's a watcher who sits on the coast of Middle-earth trying to do what is right and trying to protect and help others. And so if you want to understand why I love him so much, it's essentially that. He is the embodiment of selflessness and service and having faith in that service. But I've kind of rambled, so Anna, why don't you take over?
It's fine. I know you've been waiting months and months to ramble about the Rings of Power Círdan, so I appreciate it. But he's such an interesting character. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around 10,000 plus years of not only living, but watching your loved ones die, watching your loved ones sail away. All the while, your deepest desire is to sail with them, but out of service for others, you don't let yourself kind of give into that desire. I mean, I would absolutely never have that sort of willpower, so all power to Círdan. He's, considering how little there technically is about him in the grand scheme of things, as you said, there's not much dialogue that we get from him, things like that. It's crazy how much he gave to Middle-earth and the wider story. I mean, you mentioned that he mentors Gil-galad. He flees with him after the fall of the Falas, and it's like he kind of fosters him until he becomes the High King of the Noldor. And it's just little things like that. He does so many things like that affect the kind of greater goings-on of Middle-earth, and it all the while he's just kind of like this safe haven for people. I mean, it's no wonder why he founded so many of the havens that became these places of like refuge and solitude. It's just back to Ben Daniels, but I genuinely don't think I can think of a better person to kind of get all of that across. I'm so excited to finally see him. We've technically had a live action Círdan before, but when I say that, I mean he stood behind Galadriel and kind of stared into the distance. Yeah. But that being said, one thing that I do want from him this season, if nothing else, is when we are at the Grey Havens, I would like at least one shot of him just staring forlornly across the sea. That's all I ask for.
I mean, I almost wonder whether that's what this still is, because if you look at it, he's in his boathouse, but he's looking outwards. And I imagine if it's a boathouse, you probably have one end which is open to the water, yes, so that when the ship is finished, you basically, it's called launching, isn't it? You launch the ship into the water. So I wonder whether our very first shot of him is going to be him in his boathouse looking out to the sea, as you say, forlornly. But I think it's also interesting, and we're not going to talk about what he does in the Third Age, because obviously the show's set in the Second Age. We don't need to spend much time doing on that. But in addition to helping the kingdom of Arnor, which is obviously the descendants of Elendil and the exiled Númenorians, which obviously then leads to Aragorn, But the other main thing he does, and we've kind of touched on the fact he's going to receive one of the 3 rings of power, is that when Gandalf arrives in the Third Age, he gives up the Ring of Fire and gives it to Gandalf. And there's 2 different versions of the dialogue he gives, and one's in the Silmarillion and one's in the Unfinished Tales. And the one in the Silmarillion is kind of almost more straightforward, but I really love the one in Unfinished Tales. So I'm just going to read what he says to Gandalf when he gives him the Ring of Fire. He says, "For great labours and perils lie before you, and lest your task prove too great and wearisome, take this ring for your aid and comfort. It was entrusted to me only to keep secret, and here upon the west shores it is idle. But I deem that in days ere long to come, it should be in nobler hands than mine, that may wield it for the kindling of all hearts to courage." Now, can we appreciate that Círdan, just Middle-earth's best boy, I would argue, describes other people as nobler hands than mine, and says that it has sat idle with him on the western shore. He is so humble that after everything he will have seen in the Second Age, and one of the things we haven't mentioned is that he will be fighting at the Last Alliance alongside Gil-galad. He's one of the few who's present for the final duel with Sauron and Elendil and Gil-galad, and he's also present when Isildur refuses to destroy the ring. So he has gone through everything we've just described, and Gandalf arrives and he says, "Your hands are nobler than mine. It's sitting idle on here. I need to entrust this to you." And I just think, what a guy.
I think, a lot of people say when they finish watching The Lord of the Rings, they're like, oh, everyone should strive to be more like Samwise Gamgee, everyone should strive to be more like Aragorn. And listen, I agree, they're both great. However, I think the real message is absolutely everybody should strive to be more like Círdan, because he's just the best, like, at everything, but he'll never admit to it, which is what makes him the best.
He has the kind of humility I think all of us could only dream of having.
Yes.
Let's talk about how they might use him in the show, and this is where we'll return to that brief description we got from Prime Video. So we get him described as Master of the Grey Havens, a font of wisdom even among the High Elves. And it's worth saying, in the books, it is explicitly said that he received a foresight touching all matters of importance beyond the measure of all other elves upon Middle-earth. So even though Elrond is described as wisest in all lore, Galadriel's described as having seen far, Gil-galad, obviously an incredibly wise High King, just remember Círdan is wiser than all of them and sees further than all of them. So we get him described as that in the Prime Video description: a font of wisdom, a shipbuilder, bear of Narya, but also the bit that I think got most people excited, which is mentor to Elrond. So let's focus on just season 2 for a second, because obviously he'll do more across the other 3 seasons. But Anna, how do you see them using Círdan in this upcoming season?
So, I think they've touched on, obviously, the fact that he's going to be a mentor to Elrond, and I think that will be the most important part. We mentioned, we talked to each other before we started filming, and we said there's really not that much to talk about in regards to Elrond. But one thing that I think is quite important is when we left him in season 1, one of my favorite moments in the whole of season 1, actually, is when he confides in Durin to missing his father. And one of the things he says is, "One night it struck me that I would be only too happy to hear any judgment so long as it granted me the opportunity to have but one more conversation with my father." So he's not only craving the presence of his father, but some kind of guidance and judgment from him. And I think that it's very apt that they're giving him this mentorship from Círdan, who is not only the wisest elf in Middle-earth, but Elrond's own father was an apprentice to Círdan as well. They were fast friends, as Tolkien described it, and they had that very, very close relationship. So I feel like Elrond, especially as he kind of steps into this more warrior battle-based role, will really benefit from that. One thing I did want to touch on, though, because we mentioned the relationship between Círdan and Gil-galad, he's basically like this sort of step-in father for Gil-galad, and I wonder what sort of interactions we'll see between the two of them in season 2, because I know at this point in time, Gil-galad is already very established as the High King of the Noldor. There's no kind of loose footing there, but his foundations have sort of been shaken. We only really touched the surface with his character in season 1, but we started off with him sending out this message of peace only to kind of have it completely backfire, and now we find him preparing for war. So even as this kind of established High King, that's going to shake you quite a bit to your core. So I wonder if we'll find him leaning towards Círdan as well for that sort of guidance. And if Círdan will help him kind of step up as the mentor to Elrond as well, because we know further along down the line, that's the role that Gil-galad takes on as well. So I think, well, I hope that we'll see a lot from the three of them, not just Elrond.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think on the Elrond point, the biggest thing for me, actually, and I loved your referencing of that conversation Elrond has with Durin about his father. The other thing that reminds me of, and this is, I can't remember how much I complained about it when we talked about season 1, but it's something I've complained about quite frequently since then. It has never sat right with me that twice or maybe 3 times in season 1, Celebrimbor starts talking to Elrond about his father, Eärendil, as if they were best friends. Now, there is, of course, the possibility that Celebrimbor knew Eärendil, that they interacted. I've got no problem with that post, the fall of Gondolin. Nothing wrong with that. But the way it was portrayed in season 1 was like Celebrimbor was busy mates with Eärendil, and it just never sat right with me, partly because of Celebrimbor's lineage in terms of being, of the House of Feanor, being the son of Curufin. It never sat right with me, and also the stories he told always seemed to be in a way to get Elrond to do something for him, whether it was the story about saying that one day his life would be in Elrond's hands, or the story where he said, Eärendil said he had to go to Valinor because no one else could. And
yes,
in my headcanon, Celebrimbor was just gaslighting the ever-living, out of Elrond to get him to do what he wanted.
As you said, he is of the House of Feanor, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case.
And I'm doubtful the show will go there, but I really want them to go there and show that Celebrimbor really does have these character flaws. And the way I think Círdan weaves into this is that Círdan is the one who should be talking to Elrond about his father, because Círdan, it's not quite as much as Gil-galad, but in a similar way, he was almost a foster father to Eärendil, and more importantly, Eärendil was apprenticed to him in terms of shipbuilding. And it should be Círdan who's giving Elrond those insights into his father. And I'm sure, within the show's history, Círdan and Elrond would have had these conversations in the past. It's not like we need to pretend they've never spoken about Eärendil before. But I think what I'd love to see, and I know that I said this on Twitter, I know they don't have the rights to the passage in Histories of Middle-earth of Círdan's vision and his decision to stay in Middle-earth to serve. But I would love him to tell a version of that to Elrond as a way of trying to teach Elrond about the importance of service and faith, because I think Elrond's faith has been slightly fractured after season 1, partly because of Galadriel's actions, partly because of the way Gil-galad and Celebrimbor used him to get the mithril. He's really been quite used and had his trust broken and been lied to, and you could almost imagine that his faith, not his hope, but his faith could be quite shaken. And I would love to see Círdan step in and try to bring him back, and do that through telling stories, whether that's of his father or of his own life.
I think, or at least I hope, that is the route that they're going to take. It would be quite remiss of him to act as a mentor to Elrond very on just kind of a surface level and not bring any of these kind of character traits. As we've said before, Círdan at his core is this kind of haven. So it makes sense that he's the one that Elrond turns to. If there's anyone that you're going to trust to not let you down, it's probably him.
For those who know the story, and obviously we're not going to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read the books, but after what happens in Eregion happens, it's after that point in the story where Elrond founds Rivendell in Ladris, and he founds it as a refuge. And I think that's one of the things we need to see Círdan passing on to Elrond, the idea of being a refuge for others, being a haven for others who are in need. And so I would love that to be kind of foreshadowed early in season 2, so that when what happens later in season, not that I'm saying we'll see Rivendell founded this season, but we might see it about to happen, if you know what I mean, at the end of season 2, and we'll likely see it at the start of season 3. So I would love them to foreshadow that a little bit. And as for, you touched on as well his relationship to Gil-galad, I think about 3 episodes ago when we talked about our hopes for season 2, this is one of the things we talked about. We almost want to see, because if you think about the way Ben Walker played Gil-galad in season 1, it was very stoic, very stern. He was putting on the kingly aspect, but we didn't really get to see a softer side to him. And I think we said on our hopes for season 2, we'd both really like to see that softer side come out. And maybe it is through the introduction of his foster father figure in Círdan that we're able to see that. I would like to see Gil-galad have a bit of a crisis of faith in his own leadership. And I would like to see, Círdan step in, and whether that's support him, counsel him, that's the kind of scene I want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think from actually most of the storylines that we're getting this season, it feels very much like daddy issues central. You've got Elrond, you've got Gil-galad, you've got Durin, you've got Miriel. Everyone's just kind of going through it. So I think there's going to be a lot of this kind of familial aspect this season, which I quite like, because it gives us a chance to go deeper into these characters that we've really only scratched the surface of. As you said, I loved Benjamin Walker's performance in season 1, but he didn't have enough time to really kind of dive deeper with Gil-galad. So I'm hoping that through Círdan, that's what we're going to get this season.
I agree. And the only other characters we haven't talked about that might interact with Círdan, I guess, are Galadriel, who I imagine we'll see interact, because we're going to have the 3 rings brought from Eregion, and obviously one's going to go to Gil-galad, one to Galadriel, one to Círdan. So I'd like to see how Círdan responds to Galadriel in terms of what she's been up to, because he might have some things to say about what she did, especially after she took a journey on one of his boats and then jumped off in the sea.
Yes.
He'll be saying, I could have put someone else who wanted a ticket on that ferry, Galadriel. It's very ungrateful of you. I spent a lot of time putting effort into that boat. But on a more serious note, just this idea that she's been kind of going around like a wrecking ball. And I think, again, he could provide her some perspective. And then Celebrimbor is interesting because I really want them to have a scene together. And yes, part of that is just me wanting to see Charles Edwards and Ben Daniels in a scene together. Very selfish of me, I know. But more importantly, I would love to see what those 2 characters might say to each other, because if you have the embodiment of humility in Círdan, Celebrimbor is the embodiment of hubris and pride. And so what I would give to see them together, and even more, what I would give to see Círdan visit Eregion and see Celebrimbor with Annatar, I mean, that would be incredible.
Yes. I mean, I think we know from the Silmarillion, at least, is that Círdan was one of the first elves to be quite weary of the Noldor. So I think that will probably be on the back of his mind with Celebrimbor anyway, especially if he goes into his workshop and just see... Because listen, I'm sort of imagining that throughout the season, we'll just see Celebrimbor get kind of more and more deranged and kind of crazed as it goes on. So I feel like that's what we'll see from him. But going back to Galadriel and Círdan, I do wonder, I'm not sure if we kind of got confirmation for where the picture of her in front of the map that we got was from, but I wonder if that takes place at the Grey Havens or somewhere where Círdan has his influence. I mean, I know we said the map had that picture of Eärendil on it, which kind of makes you think, oh, who put that there? Yeah. And it also had a burning ship. So those 2 things kind of scream Círdan to me, and I wonder if that's where him and Galadriel will have this conversation if they do interact.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, as well? Because if you look at the history of Círdan from the Silmarillion, he was also fast friends with Finrod, Galadriel's brother, when Finrod had his own kingdom in Middle-earth. Círdan was allied with him and friends with him. And he's, technically in part related to Galadriel, because Galadriel's mother was one of the Teleri, so they're in a way related in terms of kinship, and are connected by things like the first kinslaying at Alqualondë, which obviously the show isn't going to touch on, but there is a kinship between them. So that's interesting. But again, I think part of that is, Galadriel has been on a very aggressive wrecking ball quest, which has led a lot of destruction in a way. And, I think that's the Noldor side of her coming out. And I almost wonder whether Círdan is going to bring that balance of the Telerin side of the elves. But as you say, that picture of her in the map room. We're also going to look at a picture later of Gil-galad in a room which has similar architecture, so it makes me wonder whether Gil-galad and Galadriel visit him together, whether this is all part of when the rings are given. There's a lot to think about there in terms of when they might interact and how.
I think just Círdan is a really, really important character to put in at this point, because the same thing that we said about Elrond having that person who knew his father so well, Galadriel now has someone who was an ally, fought alongside her brother. So I think that's kind of one of the perks to having one of the oldest elves at your disposal. You have someone who has these ties to a lot of the most important characters that we have here in season 2. So there's a lot that he can do, as you can tell by the fact that we're already 48 minutes in and we're still on Círdan.
Yeah, we'll wrap it up in a second, I think. But just on that point you raised, I think there's also something interesting in the idea that Círdan remained in Middle-earth because he felt he had, well, he didn't feel he had an obligation to stay and serve the Valar. And it's interesting in a way that Galadriel at the start of season 1 decides that her work isn't done and she needs to remain, but her version of her service is to be a counterweight, a balance, an opposing force to Sauron and the rise of evil. So they're both in their own ways committing to acts of service and postponing their return to Valinor and to their kin and their families. Galadriel would love to go and see Finrod and her other brothers and her father. I'm sure she would love to. In the same way, Círdan, we know explicitly from the books, it's his heart's greatest desire to go to Valinor, to see the Blessed Realm, to be reunited with his king and his kin. So there is a lot of similarities between them, but the kind of stark point of divergence is how they deal with that service, at least in the show's canon so far.
I'd like a scene of Gil-galad. He's had a really bad day. Him and Galadriel get to Mistland or wherever they're going, and he just kind of breaks down to Círdan and he says, I gave this huge speech. I put her on a vote to Valinor. What does she do? She jumps off, and now Sauron's on the rise again. What am I supposed to do? He's like, please, can you just talk to her for me?
Yeah, it's sort of like asking the grandparent, to have the conversation with the child. Yeah. It's like, she's not listening to me. She's older than me anyway, so this is another problem. And I think there might be that idea for Gil-galad that he still feels, I think in a way we saw Elrond not feeling worthy of his lineage and not feeling like he belongs and not knowing his place. And I wonder whether we might see a bit of that uncertainty with Gil-galad, this idea that he really only inherited the kingship because everyone else died in the Second Age in terms of the house of Fingolfin in Middle-earth. And so he inherited the high kingship of the Noldor really as a result of, kind of, to put it bluntly, elimination, last man standing. And so I do wonder whether we'll touch on that. But yeah, as you say, we've talked about Círdan for probably 40 minutes now. Is there anything we haven't touched on, anything in terms of our hopes for him in season 2, or any final thoughts you want to add before we move on to the other news?
No, I think I've talked about everything I wanted to. I'm feeling confident about his role. I know that we've just gone over quite a lot that we want from him, and a lot of it might be we might be kind of shooting for the stars there. All we have confirmation of at the moment is that he's mentoring Elrond. And listen, even if that is the only interaction we get, I will still be happy with that. I mean, I think there's a lot that we can get out of that for both characters. But I'm just so happy. This, by far, is the best news for me that we've had. I know that Círdan was probably, I think maybe the first big piece of news that was announced for season 2 was the fact that he was going to be in it. But it's the Ben Daniels as Círdan, the first look at him, the details about his boathouse. It feels like he's properly realised now. And it's just, I think, as you said before, every piece of information that we've got this week has just made me kind of more and more excited. There's nothing where I've looked at it and been like, oh, so this just,
yeah,
best day ever.
Best day ever, indeed. And I think one thing we should say as well is he might be a bit like Gil-galad in season 1, where he might not get a lot of screen time. But all I would say to people is remember that this is one of the canon characters who will be there through the remaining 3 seasons as well. Yes. He will not at any point go away. He is present for everything else that happens in the Middle-earth story of the Second Age, right up into the final year of the Second Age.
Can I just say, how insane is it going to be to see him Gil-galad, Elendil, Isildur, Galadriel, as we've seen them now, and Elrond at the time of the Last Alliance. Like, we're going to see them from now until then. Like, it's just going to be absolutely insane.
Yeah, and Celeborn will probably pop up at some point.
Oh God, I keep forgetting about Celeborn.
Me too.
So does Galadriel.
Yeah, so does everyone. Right, well, we're going to finish our section on Círdan there, but I will just say I'd like to dedicate this whole section because while I describe myself as a very big fan of Círdan, I must say our friend on Twitter, Bree, who you can find her account. There's one which is Círdan Lover, and then another art account, which I think is Tintales. But Bree does the most amazing Tolkien artwork in general, and some amazing Círdan artwork, and has been on the Ben Daniels as Círdan agenda for months on months on months. And so really, the day of that announcement, that was really Bree's day as well. So just a massive shout out to Bree and to their artwork. And I'll link to Bree's Twitter accounts in the description.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that Bree probably single-handedly manifested Ben Daniels as Círdan. She actually did a really good piece of artwork yesterday where because she had already had this art out of her interpretation of Galadriel, Gil-galad, and Círdan, and now she's kind of mashed it up with the show's interpretations of them, which is just, it's so good. Everyone go and see it. I promise you won't regret it.
It's gorgeous, and as we always say, just because the show has cast certain actors and depicted characters a certain way, that never stops you as a fan from still drawing or writing about the characters in your own headcanon. It's one of the great parts of community and fan engagement, and Bree's a great example of that. So now that we're done with Círdan, we're going to move on to, in a way, what was actually the bulk of the news last week, because while Círdan came halfway through the week, he sailed into our lives midway through the week, but already that week, good joke, Anna's laughing, you can't hear her, but she's laughing, but right at the start of the week, as I say, the day we published our 4-hour podcast on the Empire magazine, so perfect timing for us and all our listeners who were then asking, why haven't you covered all the articles?
You know what, I actually think that it was perfect timing, because given the chance, we probably would have doubled the length of that podcast episode, and I don't think anyone would have wanted that. No,
we would have recorded for 8 hours, we wouldn't have eaten, we wouldn't have slept, and by the end of it, we would have just been talking gibberish, or even more so than usual. But yes, as I said, on Monday the 8th, we got probably, I think it was about somewhere between 7 to 10 articles around that, and then throughout the week, we got a few follow-up articles. And essentially how these came out is a mix of things. So clearly several publications were invited onto set while they were filming season 2. And from what it sounds like, this was springtime last year, so around April of 2023 at the Bray Studios location. So this is where they film things like the battle sequences we've seen in the trailer and the behind the scenes. It's where they filmed Adar's orc encampment. And of course, they have a lot of the interior sets there as well at Bray Studios. And in addition to that, clearly there's also been a kind of press day where the showrunners, some of the actors have been talking to these outlets. So these articles from places like Den of Geek, Collider, IGN, Nerdist, they're a mix of those different kinds of articles. And in the description of this episode, in the show notes, I'll put links to all these articles. But when we're going to talk about all this stuff, we're just going to jump between different articles, and we won't always reference which one it's from, because otherwise we will be here all day. So feel free, if you haven't already, to go check those out. I do also want to give a shout out to our friend Beric on Twitter, Beric the Horse, who on the Monday actually compiled a thread with I think the first 8 articles that came out. So that was real help to me. So thank you, Beric. And then I know other accounts have since done the same, and theonering.net has made an article kind of recapping them all. So what we're going to talk about first is the general, what I would coin production news. So details about season 2's production, the filming, the prosthetics, set design, everything. We'll talk about all that, and then we'll move on to the different insights about specific storylines. So starting right at the top, let's talk about the set design and that aspect of production. And here's some numbers for you. So obviously, a big thing we knew 2 years ago was that while season 1 had filmed in New Zealand, from season 2 onwards, they'd moved to the UK. How did they do that? Well, here's what we learned. 70 shipping containers were transported from New Zealand to the UK. Season 2 had 120 physical sets. And 2/3 of those sets, so we're probably looking at about 80 sets, are brand new. And even some things from the season 1 sets have been adjusted to rely less on blue screen and green screen. And we get a little bit more information about how these sets are built. So whether these are new sets or old sets, they build a facade which is on the camera-facing side of the structure. And how that's built is essentially they have a steel rig, and apparently one of the reasons they use steel is so that it can be resold or repurposed after filming is complete. Then on top of the steel, they have a layer of plywood, then plaster sheets after that, and then after that, fine details are finished off with polystyrene or silicone molds. And here's another number for you. 140 individual molds were used for various sets and facades. So just starting there with the set design, I mean, Anna, the sheer scale of this production, I mean, we thought we were used to hearing and seeing about it after season 1, and we thought we kind of had a good idea. But just reading those numbers and those details, it quite literally blows my mind the effort has gone into 8 episodes of television.
It's kind of wild, but it feels like they've really realised themselves and the Middle-earth that they want to portray. You know, there's been kind of, I think it might have been the showrunners talking about how everything on season 2 is just kind of grander and more bigger scale because they've really found the Middle-earth that they want to portray, and you can kind of see that coming through here. You know, I mentioned before that I was one of the people who was a bit weary about production being moved over to the UK because I'm so used to Middle-earth being shown through the lens of New Zealand that it was kind of a shock to me. But it really feels like this has given them the kind of footing they needed to just up the scale for absolutely everything, which I think is very important because there's clearly a lot that they want to achieve this season. You know, there's new characters, there's new locations, there's huge kind of episode-long battles, and that's not something that you can really kind of put half effort into. You know, it needs to be fully realized, and I think that that's what they're doing. One thing that I found quite interesting actually was Cynthia Adai Robinson, who plays Miriel, was asked about how she felt about the move to the UK. And she made a really good point, which was that we're utilising essentially the landscape of Tolkien. Because I think a lot of people, as myself, New Zealand is Middle-earth, but you do have to remember that when Tolkien was writing these books, the landscapes of the United Kingdom, albeit probably a bit less industrialised than nowadays, were some of the inspiration behind that. So to move back to those kind of landscapes, I think is quite a nice touch from that perspective as well, because I think a lot of the actors felt more grounded within Tolkien's work there.
And to be fair, I have to, not like I'm claiming any credit for this, I wasn't actually worried about the move to the UK at all for a couple of reasons. One, like you say, it is actually the land that inspired a lot of Tolkien's writings. But two, I think people not from the UK maybe don't have a sense of the environmental and natural diversity we have here in terms of, so where they're filming at Bray Studios in Windsor Park, amazing forested areas, kind of thick forests, gorge, you know, just kind of that real sense of dense woodland. But then I know they also filmed in the Lake District, which is one of my favourite parts of the UK, real place that sits deep in my heart, where you get these beautiful sweeping hills and crags and valleys and lakes, and it is genuinely stunning. And then they've been able to film in other locations, and of course we know by moving to the UK it's allowed them to travel to Europe and off the coast of Africa because they've been to the Canary Islands. So that move has allowed them access to even more diversity of locations. And it's not in any way to denigrate New Zealand, it's just to say I think people need to realise that there is outstanding natural beauty and opportunities. And they say as much in this article. You know, a lot of the crew talk about this fact that it did give them different opportunities. Now, one of the funnier ones, which I think relates to the difficulties of filming in the UK, was production designer Christian Milstead, who said, normally if you shoot in this country, you want to start shooting in April and end up in October. But instead, they ended up shooting basically all year round, obviously, because of the nature of the production. And Lindsay Wember says that the crew shot straight through in the snow and the sleet and the rain and the wind. But what Milstead actually says, which I think is funny, is that it's been suiting our look because it's a much darker universe that we are presenting here, which I just like the idea that you've got a darker tone for season 2. Let's go film in the UK. It's dark, wet and depressing.
That part made me laugh because they clearly wanted to prevent kind of filming through that, but it worked so perfectly. They kind of saw the grey dreariness of a British wintertime and they were like, wow, that looks like the kind of depressing, battle-torn Middle Earth that we want to show. Like, wonderful.
Yeah.
And listen, if anyone who's been through a grey, horrible British winter day, it's exactly as they've described it. So I understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. And some of the other things we should talk about in terms of the move from New Zealand to the UK, some of that meant they have changed crew, which you'd expect, because some crew who work in New Zealand, then they're just not going to relocate their lives for, the next 5-6 years to work on a show. And obviously, given the length of these production cycles we've seen just for season 2, that's not really practical. So I just wanted to give people some names, which you're going to be hearing a lot over the next few seasons. So last season 1's production designer was Ramsey Avery, who was very involved in kind of the promotion for season 1. The name you'll hear this year for the production designer is Christian Milstead, who I just mentioned. The art director, the supervising art director last season was Jules Cook. This season, it's Martin Foley, who you heard in the description of Círdan's set at the start of the episode. And then the set decorator last season was Megan Vertel, who's been replaced by Tina Jones. Now, there are obviously a lot of crew that are still working on the show. So you look at the directors, obviously the showrunners, the writers, even the VFX supervisor, Jason Smith, who was featured quite heavily in the Empire feature. But it's just to give people the idea that you're going to hear some new names, but I have absolutely no worries about their ability to carry on. And then the other aspect of the move I wanted to touch on, and this goes back to, I can't remember what time of year it was. I think it was either late 2022 or early 2023, an article in The Guardian came out about the fact that some of season 1's filming in New Zealand had a really harmful environmental impact. And this was particularly around the filming for episode 7, where they wanted to transform, it into this bleak wasteland after Mount Doom's eruption. And so they were using a lot of materials that weren't biodegradable and recyclable. That there was reportedly damage to the natural landscape. And I myself at the time, despite the fact many people still like to describe me as a shill, I talked about this on my Twitter feed. I said, there is nothing less aligned with Tolkien than harming the natural environment to create art. And it really disappointed me. It didn't necessarily surprise me because I have a pretty cynical view of corporations and productions and Hollywood. So I wasn't surprised, but I was very disappointed. And in this article, talking about their move to the UK this season, we get a quote from Finlay Bradbury, who's the supervising location manager for their filming at Windsor Park, Bray Studios area. And that area is actually owned by the Crown Estate, which is basically the part of the royal family that owns a lot of land in the UK because we're a very strange country. And Bradbury talks about the fact that that they worked, quote, with the Crown Estate and all their ecologists to look at where we can improve the natural environment here. In a year or two's time, our footprint would have been pretty much disappeared. And I just wanted to raise that because, like I say, it was so disappointing to read the reporting about season 1's environmental impact and the waste of sets and things like that. And between that bit earlier we talked about with using steel so that it could be resold or reused, talking about this environmental work, working with ecologists and the Crown Estate, A, it makes me happy that they've changed their approach, and B, I think it demonstrates, and we'll come on to this later, the importance of fans being vocal about things that we're disappointed in. Because as we'll discuss in a minute, the showrunners and people involved with the show do pay attention to this stuff. And obviously the credit really has to go to The Guardian and the journalists who report on it. It's not us fans who discovered any of this information. I wanted to raise it both as a positive and an example of where I think there is great value, even as a fan of the show, of being critical of things. Not critical of like, oh, they gave the elves the wrong hairstyle, or I don't like this dialogue. I'm talking about big important issues, whether it's casting, whether it's environment, whether it's ethical production practices. These are all things I think we should be aware of and vocal about.
I don't have anything else to add. I think that was a great end to that part.
I shall get off my pulpit and we shall move from the set design and location filming. Let's move on to costume and makeup, and we'll talk about prosthetics here. So do you know what? Let's start with prosthetics. And Anna, why don't I did the numbers for the set design. So why don't you take us through some of the information we found out about the prosthetics in season 2?
Okay, so what you'll see from this is that numbers, again, is a big part in this. Everything just seems to be kind of on a grander scale here. So here are just some statistics that Harry gave me for the prosthetics. There are about 1,500 orc makeups for season 2, and that also includes 1,500 sets of teeths for season 2. And I'm not just saying teeths like that to sound like Gollum. That is how it was written in the article. Each individual orc takes about 2.5 hours to get ready, and the actors come in 2 waves early in the morning to be worked on by a team of about 100 makeup artists.
100 makeup artists? That's crazy, isn't it?
I think this is something we touched upon kind of last season and earlier this kind of run, is that the orcs' practical effects is something that we've always kind of heralded about the Rings of Power. And one thing we talked about specifically was after we had an article with Sam Hazeldine, who's playing Adar, he talked about walking onto set, and there was about, I think it might have been 90 or 100 kind of fully made up orcs just walking about. And I think that just kind of goes to show the scale of the prosthetics and the makeup department this season. It's absolutely insane, but it's really promising. I feels like they're leaning more into that sort of kind of prosthetics side of things. As you said, they're moving away from green screens. I know at some point in the article they talk about the VFX supervisor being pro prosthetics and kind of not anti green screen, but he likes to avoid it as much as possible. So just a few more things about the orcs. They've moved away from latex pieces, with the exception of obviously kind of shaping the ears and everything. And each orc makeup is made up of a cowl, a chest piece, a full head piece, and a chin piece that can be mixed and matched between background actors. So you can probably see why it takes about 100 makeup artists.
I like the idea of the chin being applied. I don't know why that in particular, but there's just something strange about thinking you've got the rest of the orc's face and it's like, and now apply the orcish chin.
I also like the idea that the chins can be mixed and matched. So they put the chin on and they're like, no, it's not for you. We'll give that one to someone else.
I mean, the interesting thing about this is you've kind of raised with the sheer numbers, and we don't get much more explanation than this in the article. I think this was the IGN article. 1,500 orc makeups. Now, it's not clear whether that's because across the course of the season they had 1,500 different extras, because obviously you might cycle extras in and out. If you're filming over months, there are going to be extras that come on to set to work for a few weeks and then go. You have to hire new extras. Who knows? Or whether it's just they'll use the same extras, but there's 1,500 different designs for individual orcs or types of orcs. But given the fact they made 1,500 sets of teeth, which are basically going to be, if you've ever worn a mouth guard, it'll basically be that. So it'll have to be molded to the extras' teeth. That makes me think that, they really did use a huge amount of extras. And I think the other interesting thing about that you get in there as well, that while some of these, as you said, pieces can be mixed and matched between background actors, there are also primary actor or primary orcs, they're described as, who have their own bespoke costumes. So we've seen a couple in some of the promotional pictures. We've seen one orc in particular who keeps appearing alongside Adar in promotional images. So he's going to have his own name, no doubt, and be prominent. And maybe he'll have his own personality. We don't know. But it's just, as you said, that idea that Jason Smith, the VFX supervisor, they describe it as he's pro prosthetics. And you basically, Sarah Gower, who is the head of the prosthetics department, says it's only really as a last resort we use the green screen club, which is, I assume, how they refer to the VFX department. So it's or digital effects. So I just think it's great that, like you say, they've recommitted that. Season 1 had some brilliant prosthetics, but clearly they're going even further this season.
Yeah, and another thing she says in that same kind of run, she says, I think that's always the best show of when the two departments come together. So it feels like they're really they're not isolating each other, the VFX and the prosthetics, they're really playing off each other. I think they'll have this really seamless blend of CGI and prosthetics because, as she says here, not everything can be achieved with prosthetics alone. She says there will be times when we have to use the green screen. For example, if somebody gets their arm chopped off, it's not things like that you can't show through prosthetics. But as I said, that mix of the two and the really close relationship between the departments, I think it will just be seamless.
Yeah, and it's good to know they're not chopping any actors' real arms off just for the sake of the show.
Just letting us know no actors are being harmed in the making.
Exactly. No horses have been harmed and no actors have been harmed. And just kind of on that point you made about the different departments working together, I think that's really good to hear, because you see a lot of criticism of big films. Like, the main example I can think of is Marvel films, where they'll basically shoot a scene with everything is green screen, including props, and then later on they'll change the way a gun looks or a costume looks in post-production in VFX. And it's just kind of, you just take the artistry out of filmmaking when you do that. I remember someone on Twitter saying, filmmaking is about making choices. And if you go through a whole filming and you don't really decide on what the costume's going to look like, and you don't really decide on what the props going to look like, and you don't really decide what the background's going to look like, and then you just throw it to the VFX team and say, go on, give us all of that, you're going to lose that sense of artistic coherence and a vision. And I think that's the biggest thing I've loved about Rings of Power. Whatever people's criticisms, you cannot look at season 1 and not say, for each location, for each type of character, for each story, there is clearly an artistic vision they were going for. And the reason it works is because everyone, from the prosthetics to the hair and makeup to the costume to the set design, it's all connected and all working together in unison.
Yes, and another thing that I really, really appreciate is that the Rings of Power gives time to these people behind the scenes. You know, like, it would be very easy of them to just release the magazine articles with the actors talking about the characters, because first and foremost, that is what people want to hear, you know, what the characters will be up to going into season 2. But there's so much that you get from these articles with the behind the scenes crew. You can feel the kind of love and the passion that went into the projects through behind the scenes, you know, even just past the sheer volume, you can feel how kind of passionate just the kind of the crew, the VFX designers, the prosthetics, even just the hair and makeup artists. Like, there's so much work that went into it, and I like that they're not kind of being sidelined. You know, they are given the time to talk about it and be celebrated for the work they do, because without them, you know, we all know that one of the biggest kind of criticisms of the Hobbit films is the horrendously CGI'd villains. And I think that, you know, without the kind of incredible work of the prosthetics, hair and makeup, VFX departments, we would probably end up with something like that again. So you can't really over exaggerate how much they do behind the scenes, you know?
I agree, and I think you're right about how telling it is that these are the people they've put forward front and center, because across these dozen articles, there's probably about 3 actors, I would say. Cynthia O'Dea-Robertson, Tristan Gravel, and Owain Arthur are really the only 3 actors which have substantial quotes in there talking about their stories, and only Cynthia, who really is the only one I've seen have a detailed interview as part of this. But instead, it's just emphasized how much this is, you know, I remember, and plug, because I know it's actually not one of my most listened to episodes, but during the off season, I got to interview Alex Dissenhoff, the cinematographer for season 1. And he talked about making the show as being like a community art project, because it's all about people coming together and bringing their skills and working together. And I love that that's reflected in the way they're promoting the season. It's lovely to see, because I don't get me wrong, I like hearing from the actors, but there's only so much they can say about season 2, because they're not allowed to touch on spoilers. Whereas you can have the prosthetics person talking about the intricacies of teeth, or the stunt director talking about doing amazing pieces of wire work, you know.
The intricacy of teeth, Harry.
Sorry. Thank you, Gollum. Anyway, moving on to costume, hair, and makeup. We didn't get too much in here, and we'll touch on some of this in once again in the Númenor section. We did get, I think, probably one of our first quotes from the costume designer. So this is Luca Mosca. And I put this one on Twitter yesterday, but it was a beautiful bit of insight. So he was talking about Galadriel and Miriel's dresses, and he was saying that there are details that probably won't even be visible on screen, but they enrich the costumes in front of the camera. So he said, you may not notice this, but the silk satin underneath has been braided, meaning the dye goes from one color to the other. It can go from light to dark. And I think it is just fantastic, because it's not in your face, but it's there. And when I posted this on Twitter yesterday, I can't remember who it was. Someone in my comments said, that's fascinating because they'd been looking at two different pictures of Galadriel's dress, the one we see in that picture of the map room and when she's one of the three hands wearing the rings. And they were saying, I was wondering why it looked like a different color. And it's clearly because of this technique that Mosca's used as a costume designer to basically make the fabric almost shimmer and change colors. And I just thought, it's kind of like how in Fellowship of the Ring that one of the elves tells the hobbits that magic, could you say the way elves make their clothes is magic? Is it in the process of making these cloaks that's magic? And I just thought costume design is actually magic. I just didn't know it.
It is, and I love I absolutely love the idea that they didn't even do it really for the audience to pick up on it, because he's very kind of clear that it's something that people probably wouldn't notice, unless you're one of the people like we are who spend hours kind of zooming into these pictures and analysing every detail. But that's something that I kind of picked up on through a lot of these articles about set design, costume design. We'll get onto Númenor a bit more later, but there's kind of a part where they talk about a shrine being added to, I think it's kind of the main courtroom in Númenor, but it's not something that really the audience is going to notice. It was more for the immersion of the set and just the characters and the actors walking onto the set. And I think that the little details like that are really, really important. Sorry, I'm like in awe of all the people behind the scenes. They're just incredible.
Let's finish on the kind of costume part, because we got a little bit of insight into armor. Now, obviously, we've already seen some beautiful armor. We'll talk about Elrond's later, because we got a new, even more high-definition picture of his armor. We've seen Galadriel's, we've seen Adar's, but we get a brief snippet, and I think this is from this is either the Den of Geek or the TV Insider article, which was a set report where they talk about walking through the set and the production. And so this is what the quote says. So, lead armorer Mark Miller and his team have produced hundreds of pieces of armor, some of which we get to see as we walk around the costume department and armory, accompanied by the sound of hammers and the smell of paint. Sitting out on display is an impressive-looking helmet with a bearded face molded onto it in golden eyes. So we recognize that part of the quote as the dwarvish armor we saw in season 1. And then it continues. Just across the table is a piece of armor with snake details, including the Ouroboros symbol, a snake eating its own tail, symbolizing immortality and eternity. And I think this is the first description we have had of the armor we've seen Sauron wearing in the trailer, where he's wearing this kind of black robe with swirled kind of patterns. He's got this kind of scale mail across his collarbone and on one of his shoulders, and then around his waist and a sash kind of running vertically, he's got these spirals, and particularly on the kind of sash around his waist, it is this helix spiral pattern. Now, we don't know if this is the costume designers and the armorers who've told them that it's meant to be the Ouroboros symbol, or if it's just the writer of this article's interpretation. But I love the idea of incorporating, A, snake imagery, and B, specifically the Ouroboros self-eating snake. I mean, that is, in a way, that is who Sauron is. He's the Ouroboros eating himself in order to try and be immortal and eternal and all-powerful.
I would very much like it if they go down that route. I mean, we've seen the snake imagery kind of over and over again for this season, and I really like that they're leaning into that. We got a quote last time about him being described as an Old Testament prophet, so I do like that they're leaning into this sort of biblical, deceptive, snakish influence that Sauron has. But on the armor thing, it's actually the end of that quote that really, really stuck out to me about the orcs' armor. They say, the orc armor is an impressive mishmash of influences, as the idea behind it is that the orcs have looted it from other cultures and mixed that in with the bones of their enemies, which one is just, I think it works really well with the orcs that we've seen in season 1. They have these kind of makeshift encampments set up, and you can't really imagine that they have this huge armory as the elves may have, where they're kind of building their own armor to them. So it makes sense that they're kind of picking it up from people that they've killed along the way. And I also love the inclusion of the bones of their enemies being mixed into it. And we actually do see this in the photo of Damrod, the hill troll that we get. He's wearing a load of skulls on the front of his skirt, shorts, whatever he's wearing. He's got loads of skulls mixed in with it. So he's gone for like the Gollum-esque scrap of cloth in front of his. Yeah, but I just love the inclusion of the bones as well. So they're not only looting from their enemies, they're mixing kind of parts of their dead bodies in with the armor as well, which is horrific, but it really ties into that kind of more dark, brutal tone in season 2, I think.
Yeah, I think this idea of orcs as almost scavengers. They're like vultures or hyenas. They're not predators. They're not apex predators, but they're vicious and they will scavenge what they will need, and they will kind of live this life of living on the edge of existence and hunger and the need to survive. And I think that's a really, like you say, just incorporating that into the costume is great. I think that's kind of everything we want to talk about on prosthetics and costume, unless there's anything else I've missed, Anna, there that you wanted to touch on.
No, I think that's everything I want to talk about, really. I mean, the prosthetics and the costuming isn't something that I felt like needed to be improved from season 1, but it clearly has been improved regardless, and it's very good to see. Not that there was like, I loved the things we got from season 1, but it feels like they've just kind of scaled everything up now, which is it's what you'd expect kind of as a television show like this goes on. They're kind of finding their confidence with it. They're able to do things with this grander scale, and it's really showing so far. I think we can see that it's working.
Definitely. So the last bit of production detail we got was the stunt work. So a few more kind of facts about the stunt work. So stunt rehearsals kicked off about 4 months before shooting started. Now, bear in mind that they started filming I think production started officially in October 2022, so literally as season 2 was airing, they'd already started work on season 2. So there's a good chance that they could have been getting into stunt rehearsals while they were already on the kind of promo tour for season 1 and attending the London premiere. They were probably already the next week going back into the gym and starting work on stunts, which is kind of incredible. In other interesting facts, many of the lead actors on Rings of Power do their own stunts because they want to, and the doubles are really only brought in for the high skill or high impact moments. In particular, the articles highlighted some characters which are getting more stunt work this season. So Morvith Clark, who obviously got a fair bit last season. Charlie Vickers is Sauron, which is interesting because Charlie tried to claim he doesn't have many fight scenes this season, so I wonder whether he's being a little bit cheeky there. Robert Aramayo as Elrond obviously really didn't get a lot of stunts last season, so very excited to see what might happen there. And we'll touch on one of Elrond's stunts when we get to him later, but let's just say there's a big one coming for him. And this is a bit I actually want to discuss with you, Anna, which I thought was fascinating. In the IGN article, it says, there is also a considerable amount of thought that goes into the stunts of the older elves as they're more experienced. So, one, that makes me think that they probably very much differentiate between the fighting styles of an Elrond or an Arondir, who are much younger elves, and the likes of Galadriel. But when they said older elves, it also made me think about, we're going to get some Celebrimbor stunt scenes. We're going to get to see Celebrimbor fighting. Now, they might have just been referring to Galadriel and, to that extent, because she is one of the older elves and is more experienced. But part of me was just like, oh, please let me see Celebrimbor have at least one fight scene in defense of Eregion.
I don't know, though, because I know that Galadriel is considerably older than Elrond, but in terms of where she's at within herself, I feel like her fighting style is going to be more similar to Arondir and Elrond, because she's still very much kind of spontaneous and brash and still within that mindset despite her age. So I think that her fighting style kind of mirrors that a bit more, and I feel like the more experienced elves that we get will be kind of the Gil-galads, which, listen, I'm very much hoping, and we'll get onto this in a bit, that we will see him and his spear in action finally. So I'm hoping for some kind of stunts in that way. But listen, if we got a Celebrimbor stunt scene, like, absolutely incredible, I think that would be wonderful, if not just for you.
I mean, there's one passage in the Unfinished Tales which everyone will know what I'm talking about, where he's got to stand defiant at one point, and I hope it's not just him getting kind of bundled over and then going, "Oh no, I can't fight for myself."
I think it would be quite remiss of them to do that. You know, I know that Charles Edwards is an older actor, but it is weird that the elven ages, because he's in great shape. He looks incredible. I'm sure he can do like as many stunts as everyone else, but the elf ages are just very strange. You know, if you hadn't say read the Silmarillion and you come in to watch the Rings of Power, you would probably look at Galadriel and Gil-galad and think that Gil-galad was the older elf, but we know that he isn't. So I don't think they're kind of, I hope that the showrunners aren't going to let the kind of outward appearance of the elves dictate the way their age is shown in the show, if that makes sense. And I hope that shows through the fighting that they do as well.
Yeah, and we know as well that we're not just thinking of the main cast here. I mean, we know Selena Lowe, who's been cast as one of the elves. We see her in the trailer. She's one of the new cast. And her background is, while she is an actor as well, her primary background in terms of filmmaking is action film. She's got a background in martial arts. So we're probably, much like with Arondir, we're going to see new fighting styles. We're going to see more physical, more athletic, more acrobatic. And even when we're here talking about the more experienced elves, as we talked about earlier, Círdan will fight at the Last Alliance. Now, I don't think he'll do much fighting in the seasons preceding that, because I think it's quite important, actually, that Círdan is only seen to be a figure that goes to war as a last resort. And so I kind of, even though I'd like to see Ben Daniels do loads of stunt work, I think it's actually important for Círdan's character that he isn't, just pulling out a sword at the first opportunity and going to lop off the head of an orc. But we'll see. Maybe next season we might see a little bit of it as the War of the Elves and Sauron continues. But yeah, we'll see. Okay, and then in terms of other information on the stunt work, we get a bit about the fact that there's 20 stunt orcs who are, their primary job is doing the stunts in character, and then another 40 to 50 background orcs that cycle in and out of stunts as needed. And then, other information we get about the stunts, which I think is really the only last bit, is that we find out we are going to get a lot more battle action from Elrond, High King Gil-galad, Isildur, and Sauron.
And listen, they mention that High King Gil-galad is getting more battle action, and they also say that we will be seeing crossbows, bows and arrows, swords, spears, daggers. Each character will have their own specialized weapons. And I literally said this about 5 minutes ago, but I just want to see a Gil-galad and Aeglos in battle, just cutting down a load of orcs. That's all I ask from this season.
I mean, it's kind of brilliant and frustrating that in none of the trailers or pictures so far we haven't seen Gil-galad armored.
I know.
And my hope is they're just saving it for us because he's going to look so amazing. Like, I can't even, having seen what armor they gave Elrond, I'm just like, Benjamin Walker is an absolute tank of a human being as well. Like, if you've ever, I saw him in real life at the premiere, and he, not only is he tall, he is one of the most broad-shouldered men you will ever see. He is, as we say in the UK, he's built like a brick outhouse. And I'm just, like you say, we know there's going to be many more battle scenes for Gil-galad in the future of the show. And here's the thing that I was interested in. Technically, going by the books, you could get through season 2 and what happens at Eregion without Gil-galad doing any fighting. You could like, it would not break the lore at all. It would be probably technically more accurate to the books. But all I would say is, why miss out on the opportunity to have Gil-galad slaying orcs with his spear and using his brass knuckle rings to punch them?
Oh, yes. And listen, one thing that I'll say on the kind of hair and makeup, which I didn't mention before actually, is I've mentioned this to Harry before. I'm not sure how I feel about the kind of hairstyle they've given Gil-galad this season. For anyone who hasn't seen the pictures that have been released of him,
hang on. Let's just save that for when we get to Gil-galad and Elrond. Okay. Not because I want you to talk about it, just because that gives us something to talk about there.
Okay. Yeah, cool. I mean, there's not much else we can talk about there, really, is there?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've talked about all the production details. Now we're kind of going to get into the meat of where the articles talk about the season's themes, plots, characters, all that sort of thing. And we'll get into the themes in a second, but I think some of the most interesting aspects of these articles were when the showrunners, so this is J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, talk about the Rings of Power as a project, as a production, all those sort of things. And I just want to start with this one quote they gave, which I think really sums up the two of them as human beings, where Patrick McKay says, "We took this insane, ambitious project on because we had a story we wanted to tell and we felt needed to be told. We were willing to give our lives for a long time to tell it. This plan hasn't changed." And I want to say, for all the criticism they get, I do think more respect needs to be put onto JD Payne and Patrick McKay's names, because regardless of what you think, regardless of what criticisms you have, dedicating what will probably end up being a decade of their life to this is, in the way we talked about Círdan, it's an act of service. And I know it's a job, and I know they're getting paid for it, and I know a lot of people will sit there and say, well, it's my dream job. And yes, I'm sure it is, but there is a difference between it being a dream and the reality of dedicating your life to 10 years of working on a show when you're going to get abuse, criticism, all the stuff we see, and just the toll it's going to take on them across the decade. So I just wanted to start with that, because I think it does need to be reminded sometimes that the people working on the show are giving up years of their life to work on it, and it is a job for them. And, yes, I would trade places with them in a heartbeat, but I still don't think that should stop us giving appreciation and respect to them, if you know what I mean.
I agree, and I think one thing to take from these articles that we've got, and we'll go into what they say a bit more, is just how much they care. They are Tolkien fans at their core. They care so much about the story that they're telling. They care about the fans. They're receptive to feedback, which, as you said, they get a lot of abuse from the same type of people who tend to hate on anything Rings of Power related. So kind of weeding out the genuine criticism and just setting it apart to that hate must be quite hard. They're gonna see some like horrible things probably during their time. So it's nice that they're kind of locked into this for a decade, and it does make me wonder how long we'll be doing this as well. Like in 8 years when we're on like season 4, will we still be here going, so here's what happened. Here's what we got from today's teaser trailer. Are we locked in for life as well?
I like to think we're not. I like to think both of us, this isn't a job for us. We're not getting paid for this. Neither of us have earned a single penny from doing this, and likely won't across however many years we do this. And I like to think at some point, if we just go, I cannot spend another 4 hours talking to Harry and then do it again the week after. I think if it's one day we decide to do that, that's fine. I mean, I'll watch the show obviously for the next, however many years it's going on. But but it's a great point, Anna, because it is like, when we think about what they're committing, you do stop and think like, well, for the listeners who want to know, I turned 30 this year, and I'm kind of like, do I want to be 35, 36 still talking about this, doing a podcast? Like, maybe I do. I don't know. Who knows where I'll be? Who knows what I'll be doing in my life? But it is a funny thing to think about. But it also allows you to reflect on the sacrifice the showrunners and the actors are making, and the crew, everyone involved. It's that. But I want to pick up on something you said about the fan feedback, because I think one of the most interesting insights we got from one of these interviews was where McKay and Payne talked about how they respond to people's perceptions of the show. So McKay said, part of the learning process for us on this is really seeing what people seem to respond to in the show. Payne added, we also take in everything. We read everything. We read the reviews. We read what you all have written. We read what your colleagues have written. And we read what the fans are saying. God help them if that last bit is true. And then Payne also emphasized, it empowers you to see what people respond to. And it's always obvious. People respond to Tolkien. That's why Tolkien is what, next to the Bible and the Quran, reaches readers around the world with a number of copies sold. So let's double down on Tolkien and go back to those things that draw people in. And then they also say, we had a plan and we're sticking with it. We have to do what we believe in. And what I love about this is the fact that, yes, they're listening to the critics. Yes, they're listening to the fans. Yes, they're listening to how people react to the show. But the thing I love most of all is that they have a plan and they're sticking to it. Because I know a lot of people have the view that showrunners and artists and creators should just listen to the fans and give the fans what they want. I am very anti that, because there is no such thing as one homogenous view of what the fans want or one homogenous view of what the critics want. So I think it's great to listen to all of that. And no doubt they found points of consensus. Later we hear about Owain Arthur saying that they were shocked how much people loved Elrond and Durin's relationship. And all of us are going, how can you be shocked? But of course, when you're making it, you don't know how people are going to respond to it. And that relationship wasn't a thing from Tolkien. That was something they created themselves on the show. I admire them for reading everything, because I can't. If I get one mean comment about the podcast, I have to log off for the day. But I love that they read it, they listen to it, but they have a plan and they're sticking to it. So I love that they're doing that. I think this was probably, everything I read, maybe the most encouraging thing I read from the showrunners.
Yeah, I really like what they've said, but I also really like what you've said, because it's weird, because we spend so much of our time kind of within not just the general Tolkien community, but the Rings of Power community specifically. So we see kind of everything that people are saying, the theories, the kind of hopes, and it is great to me that not everything is taken on board and listened to. We talked about last week that some people think that Estrid, one of the new original characters, is actually Shelob in disguise. And it's things like that people seem to genuinely want, that kind of plot twist. That's the kind of thing that I'm glad that doesn't get taken on board. And listen, if you like the kind of plot twisty bait and switch things, that's fine. That's fine with me. But I like that they've got this plan in mind, but they're still open to the genuine criticism and feedback. And I think that's the perfect way to be. They're not wish-washy on the kind of vision they have for the series, but they're also willing to change small aspects that need to be changed.
I think we're on agreement on that. I do think there is one funny thing they said, and Anna and I have talked about this before we started recording, which was, yes, they talked about the increased scope of season 2 and the idea that even though it's the same pattern, it's going to feel bigger if they've done their jobs right. But they also said, and obviously these interviews and set visits were conducted in the middle of production, April, I think it was, 2023. But there's a great bit where Payne and McKay are talking about the accelerated production schedule. So they said, definitely some things speed up in season 2 because we've cast a lot of the show. We don't have COVID. It accelerates what we did in season 1. There are places where things go faster. And then McKay said, I would say season 2 is going to take about half as long as season 1 did, or even less. So far, so good. Now, obviously, the show is coming out almost exactly 2 years to the day after season 1 had. Now, to be fair to the showrunners, season 1 technically did take longer because, they started in like 2019 and they had production interrupted with COVID. So maybe in that sense, they're saying it took about half as long. But I think it's kind of charming because it's like, obviously they felt like they were going faster and certain things were moving faster. But it's also a reminder that you just can't really rush a show this big. And so, they filmed for almost a year, I think it was. The post-production will have taken about that same length of time. And that's just if you want a show this big with 120 sets and, 1,500 orc prosthetics and the best visual effects that we see on any TV show out there, then I'm afraid this is it, guys. We're going to be waiting a long time. But I like their optimism.
Me too. As you said, it's quite charming. And I think the last thing that I wanted to touch on that they talk about is just the kind of the word earnest is repeated quite a lot in these articles, both by the showrunners and also Cynthia Adai Robinson talks about it. And what the showrunners say is, there's an earnestness to Middle-earth and its stories, and we happily embrace that. It's not darkness for the sake of darkness. And then Cynthia also says, when she's asked about the kind of darker tone of season 2 and how she deals with that as Miriel, she says, it's about returning to the things that sometimes can feel very earnest. And I remember that when we talked about our hopes for season 2 before the trailer came out, one thing that you said was that you hope that within the darker tone of season 2, they don't lose the little moments of kind of lightness and joy that feel very close to Tolkien and what he got across in his stories. And it fills me with a good sense of confidence to know that, there's been a lot of talk about how dark and brutal and bloodthirsty season 2 is going to be, but they're very aware that they need to stay true to this kind of earnestness of Middle-earth and just Tolkien stories in general. So I really like that they touched on that.
Yeah, and you're so right, because I even entitled a whole section of my notes "Descent into Darkness," because across these articles there are literally dozens of quotes of the showrunners or the production crew or the actors saying it's darker, we go to darker places, there's darkness, and it would be very easy to think, oh, they're just kind of going grim dark, kind of dark fantasy, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon. But like you say, this point they return to is earnestness. And there's a great bit where Patrick McKay says, it's really hip to be cynical and roll your eyes and be postmodern and winky, winky, winky. And we're just not going to play that game. And Patrick McKay, I love you for saying that, because there is nothing wrong with fiction that is a bit cynical, is a bit satirical, which is, kind of looks at our own real world and plays that into fantasy. I read a lot of books like that. I watch a lot of shows that are quite cynical and satirical and a bit postmodern. But my God, if there's one thing that doesn't belong in Tolkien is cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
That point you make about that both the showrunners and the cast have repeated about earnestness and hope is so important, because Tolkien stories should never be dark for the sake of darkness. There should always be the sense of hope, the sense of redemption, the light, and the reason why the characters are fighting. Like you say, I think Cynthia says something about this idea that there has to be something people are fighting for, and there has to be a sense that it's worth fighting for, to almost quote Sam. It's really important that a show like Rings of Power, as it explores darker themes, whether that's with Sauron, whether that's with Númenor, the dwarves in Khazad-dûm, it's so important you don't lose the sense of hope, of earnestness, of just light that is present throughout Tolkien's stories.
Yeah, and it's as you said, this whole thing has just filled me with confidence, because they seem to just be very aware of what they need from this season in terms of tone, but the things that they don't want to lose in the process as well. So I think it's very nice that they've kind of got all that on board. They're thinking of that as they're going through. And can I just say that I think that you and Patrick McKay would be very good friends, because if you gave me that quote of his out of context, I genuinely would think it's something that you said, just that you just made up.
I do think I am the sort of person to say, it's very hip to be cynical and roll your eyes and be postmodern and winky. Like, I would definitely say wink, wink, wink.
You
that
would.
Is, I know Patrick isn't listening to this, but Patrick, if you ever hear this, I'm with you on that. And I also talk like that. I'm sorry. Bad news for you, I guess, seeing as you're a successful showrunner and I'm podcasting, but listen, kindred spirits and all that. But yeah, and I think they still, are committed to the darkness, and this will probably lead us into talking about Sauron and Sauron's place at the center of the story, because they talk about Sauron as being the spine of the season, of the way he is infecting the land with darkness. But they also still have that point about, even Sauron believes he's doing the right thing. And Payne says, in his own twisted way, he thinks he's healing Middle-earth. It's not darkness for the sake of darkness. And once again, Payne says, it's more about the darkness being the core ethos at the center of the story. He says what they want to avoid is anything that's nihilistic or bleak or cynical, where people are just screwing each other over for their self-gain. And even Sauron, he doesn't think he's doing that. Now, he might be doing that, but he doesn't think he's doing that.
Sorry, before we move on, something that just makes me laugh is I remember in the article that we got about Tom Bombadil is he's described as being kind of a light in the darkness of season 2. And I like the idea that I obviously I know that this isn't what happened, but I like the idea that they start mapping out season 2 and they're like, oh my God, this is so brutal and bloodthirsty. We need a miracle to make this kind of happy again. And they call on the absolute last resort, the most whimsical man in Middle-earth, to add a little bit of light to season 2.
Yeah. It's as much as I am anti-whimsy, it is important to have the light amidst the dark. So welcome back. Friendship with Tom Bombadil, potential in the future. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm open to enjoying a bit of lightness. Anyway, we're going to move on before I say something I'll regret. So as we've kind of indicated, this is going to be a dark season, and through these articles and interviews, the overarching message is season 2, it's Sauron season, baby, or more appropriately, as they say, it's the season of villains. So I'm just going to read out one big quote from JD Payne about the season's focus, and then we can kind of discuss on from there and talk about how Sauron fits into this. But I'll just set the scene with this quote from JD Payne. So he says, "You remember in season 1 how it didn't end exactly as he would have hoped. Galadriel cast him out, and he's left with basically nothing. She has the 3 rings, he has no friends, he has no army, he has no allies, no weapons, basically no resources except for his own cunning." Which, by the way, I just love how pathetic that makes Sauron sound. Anyway, JD Payne continues, "Season 1 was all about the heroes and setting the table with Galadriel, with the dwarves, with Númenor, and with the Southlanders. Season 2 is going to be all about the villains, and specifically all about Sauron. We're going to watch as he uses deception, manipulation, lies, coercion, cunning to start to set the chess pieces in motion. He's going to go to this person over here and sort of set this group against that group over there and start using people's inherent trusts and mistrusts and fears against them to start to set up the situations that are all beneficial to him." So that's the scene setter, and I think for all we talked about, were there too many mystery boxes in season 1? How did people feel about that? They are being very upfront about what seasons 2 focuses. And if anyone goes into season 2 saying, "Oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be," frankly, you've only got yourself to blame, because the showrunners are saying it outright. It's Sauron season, it's the season of villains, and he is the spine that connects all these stories.
I mean, I'm going to echo, I think, a lot of what I said last episode when we talked about kind of Annatar Celebrimbor. It's just that I feel very confident in the spotlight that they're giving to them this season, especially Annatar, because it was a bit of a worry, how they would handle him, because there was this huge reveal at the end of season 1, and it's like, are they going to go down the route of, okay, what form is he going to show up in next? Do we have to guess who it's going to be? But as you said, they're being very clear that it's Sauron season. We will be seeing him as Annatar, though I don't know if they reference him as Annatar in these articles at all, but do they?
There's one, I mean, he's been referenced as Annatar in the Empire article, and he's referenced in at least one of these articles as Annatar, so it is very clear they are going with that name, which is obviously great news.
Yeah, so it's great news, and I like that they've really emphasized the reach that he has, because, it is quite impressive, as you say. He's in a kind of pathetic situation at the start of season 2. He has quite literally nothing except his own cunning, but what you realize about Sauron is that's all he needs. That is his greatest power, is his cunning and his deception, and all he needs is that one foothold in someone's mind, in someone's character, in a kingdom, and then, as they said very aptly in the teaser trailer, he just slithers in. So it's once he has that hold within someone, and they mention, I think in maybe a different article, that what season 1 set up very well is the cracks within the foundations of not just people, but also kind of stories and kingdoms and places. There are cracks now for Sauron to go in. He doesn't have allies, weapons, resources, but he has a starting point for his deception, and that's all that he needs,
Exactly. And I think, if you read these articles, one of the things you'll find, and I might edit this in to say earlier in the piece, but if you're listening to this far, then you'll get the message. One of the things you've got to be aware of, what will have happened with these interviews is the journalists will have come into the room and they would have all listened to Patrick and JD speak at the same time. So what you'll find is a lot of these quotes are repeated by different outlets, but sometimes you get more detail in one article than the other, and you get slightly different phrasing, and that's because they will have either been making notes or using a microphone to record it. So you've just got to, sometimes you'll read things and you go, "Oh, that I don't understand the phrasing," and then you'll read another article and it'll make sense. So that's a frustration I have with media, but it also goes back to a point I made on Twitter the other day and then deleted the tweet because I was accidentally causing arguments.
I was wondering what that was, because I saw the after tweet, but I didn't see the original.
Yeah. So essentially, for listeners, what I tweeted was, I said that essentially there's been an article, and maybe we can discuss this later. There'd been an article, I think it was from Collider, maybe Den of Geek, I can't remember, where the writer basically said that they thought, and they concluded from what they'd seen on set, that the One Ring wasn't going to be made in season 2, and that they might have it happen post-Rhaegon, which could happen, it wouldn't line up with the books, but I can see ways they could do it. But a lot of people on Twitter, I can't remember who posted it first, but someone posted it and they just posted the quote and didn't say that this was a quote from the author of the article, not one of the showrunners or not, someone who officially works for the show. And then I saw people on the timeline going, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. This is, bad news. I don't like this. I like this. And the tweet I made was basically saying, can we not have a panic every time a quote is put out by someone else speculating on the show as if it was someone who works on the show? And it was a bit catty of me and a bit, and so I deleted it because it just caused more arguments. But the point I was trying to make, and I do have an issue with this, and, people on Twitter have to be careful about this. If you are going to post a quote on Twitter, be very clear about who said it and be very clear if it's a direct quote or a secondhand quote, because it just ends up, this is such a small thing and it does show that I'm terminally online and I feel stupid talking about this. But we do need to be careful because when it comes to stuff like the Barrow White stuff, last week we talked about where certain quotes were misattributed, or with this, we just need to be a little more careful about what we say a quote is and who said it. Anyway, we don't have to linger on that. Let's get back to talking about Sauron. But there's lots of great quotes in here about Sauron's psychology, about the different storylines that Sauron will be involved in. I don't know if there's any one in particular that you want to pick up on, Anna, from the different things we've heard about Sauron in season 2 here.
Yeah, so I think the two things that I actually wanted to talk about the most, you can tell me which one to go for first, is the prologue, because we get some information about that and how that's going to go down. But we also get a few pictures of Annatar / Halbrand with Celebrimbor. And I think that's really interesting. So I'd like to talk about kind of both of those things.
Yeah, let's talk about that that first one, the prologue. So I'll kind of set up what the context of this is, and then you can read through the quote and explain to the audience your perspective on it. So in one of the articles, it said that the journalists who visited the set, the showrunners gave them a brief description of season 2's prologue and opening scene, which involves Sauron. So over to you, Anna, on that.
So the quote says, "The roots of his current Halbrand form are explained in the season's brutal opening scene, which showrunner J.D. Payne describes as an Ides of March-esque sequence that fellow showrunner Patrick McKay says will make you pity the Dark Lord." That's kind of a brief description, but the next part's quite interesting as well. They say, surrounded by hand-painted storyboard art and 3D models of sets, the showrunners explain this opener in vivid detail, with pure glee on their faces. They, like our group, just love Tolkien. I think that's a really nice little part at the end. The fact that they're getting kind of excited when they talk about how this is going to go down. I feel like we experienced this sometimes, like when we were talking about Círdan, we got kind of a bit into it because it was just like the inner Tolkien nerd coming out. And it's nice to know that they do the same thing when they're talking about the Rings of Power as well. So obviously I think the main thing that I picked up out of this was the reference to the Ides of March, which is, for people who don't know, the kind of assassination of Caesar. And I think that that's a really, really interesting point, because what we'll know from this is that we're probably going to see Adar kill, or what he thinks is killing, Sauron. And the parallel of that to the assassination of Caesar is very, very interesting. And it makes me wonder as well if it's not just Adar who starts that, but if all of the orcs around them as well will kind of revolt against Sauron, and that's what we see in the prologue. And I like that it's just called brutal, because we know that this is the prologue, so there's no kind of nothing held back. They're going straight into how brutal and bloodthirsty it is, and it must be crazy if it's going to make us pity Sauron. I'm very excited to see how that goes.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because the other piece of information we got about it, and can I just say, I'm about to do a little lap of honor for myself, and this isn't based on any leaks, because I didn't get any leaks about Sauron's story or the prologue or anything like that. This was just me being so good at analysing trailer. God, what a pathetic thing to be bragging about. But so the other information we got from the IGN article was season 2 will open at the same fortress that Galadriel took her soldiers to in season 1, and there's a good reason she sensed evil in that ice cave. Season 2 will also give us a glimpse of just how hard Sauron is to kill, even before the One Ring. So, in the trailer, we see one of the last shots of the teaser trailer, and we obviously talked about this on our analysis episode. We saw the interior of that what was it called? Durnost, the fortress in the Forodwaith that we saw in season 1, and we get a brief shot of the inside of that room that Galadriel found with the anvil and Sauron's mark. And you get a flash of light, and then we see the castle doing its frozen transformation on the exterior. Now, if you pause that frame at the right time, as I did, and maybe I'll link to it, my tweet about it the day after the trailer, because I'm just a little bit proud of this. You can see that the room is filled with figures, which are probably orcs, and in the center you can see 2 figures, which look bigger. So I assume we are going to see the moment where, as Adar said in season 1 to Galadriel, he said, I sacrificed enough of my children for his, meaning Sauron, for his aspirations, and then he says, I split him open. So clearly what we're going to see is Sauron messing with the power of the unseen world in the frozen north, sacrificing orcs in some way, and Adar betrays him, turns on him. Now, the Ides of March makes you think that it's going to be Adar basically grabbing hold of him and then orcs just stabbing Sauron in the back with ferocious force, which could be a pretty horrifying. And so I could imagine how we might pity him if we for that scene, if we focus on Sauron's face and see the betrayal and the pain as he's basically getting, Julius Caesar. One funny thing I did think about this, because they described it as the Ides of March, I do think about the speech from Shakespeare's Caesar, and there's an amazing performance of it on YouTube you can find of Damian Lewis performing the Brutus is an honourable man speech. And I just thought, who is it in Middle-earth who could say, but Adar is an honourable man? And we could have a great version of that. Sorry, I'm going way off tangent. But it's great to know that I think we have arrived where we probably thought we would, even on our hopes for season 2 episode, that season 2 will open with a prologue focused on Sauron, and in particular how he ended up as Halbrand. Because clearly, after Adar kills him, where does he go next?
Yes, and I know we've talked about this before, but I am a very big fan of horror movies, and I love kind of like body horror and the sort of effects that go into that. So not only am I excited for just the kind of brutality of season 2, I know we get this clip of what we have assumed, and I think that the Rings of Power have kind of played into this being what we think it is kind of Sauron's body reforming after he's killed. And we've only seen like a very brief clip of that, but I can imagine that the full thing is going to be quite horrific. And considering the work we know has gone into the kind of VFX and effects this season, I can imagine it's going to be quite grotesque. But I'm excited for that, but I'm also excited for the kind of psychology and thoughts behind why he chose Halbrand, because it was mentioned in an article before this set came out that he catered his Halbrand form to Galadriel. That was the front he put on for her. So I'm very excited to see how he ends up as that. Is it something that he kind of learns? Does he spend time around the Southlanders to kind of pick up their traits, things like that? I think it'll be really interesting to see, and I think that it will maybe not humanize, but get the audience a little bit closer to Sauron, because, one of my biggest complaints about the Lord of the Rings trilogy has always been that a viewer of those films will come away and Sauron will always just be this giant eye to them. So I do very much like that we're getting this in-depth, it is almost a humanization of Sauron, which I'd really like.
Yeah, and from that, I'll kind of lead us into a quote from J.D. Payne on Sauron's psychology, which I think is super interesting. It's quite long, so you'll have to bear with me, but I think it gives you a real insight into how they're going to approach kind of following that prologue scene, or, from the point of Adar's betrayal, how they're going to portray him. So J.D. Payne says, Sauron is able to take the things you want to do that are good and turn those against you. It's the ring personified. The ring offers you ultimate power, and when you give someone power, you see what's really inside them. When you see Sauron having relationships with people, he doesn't have normal relationships because he empowers them, in theory, after a good end. But then you watch as both that end and the person who is being empowered to work towards it are twisted by their proximity to and interactions with Sauron. We're going to talk about Celebrimbor in a second, because I can't think of proximity and interactions as anyone else. And then finally he says, we go deeper into Sauron. How did he become that way? And why? What does he really want? And how is his dream to pursue that going to test and twist him more than he might already be? And that last bit, how is the dream to pursue that's going to test and twist him more than he might already be? And that just gets me so excited, because I love the idea that not only are we going to see maybe, if not a sympathetic side to Sauron, just a way to understand him, but then we're going to see him become more twisted by his dream, which is exactly how it should be.
Yeah, and I like the part about his relationships with people, because obviously I know that the people being twisted by their proximity to him, obviously in this context refers to Celebrimbor, but I do want to talk about this a bit more when we get to Galadriel, but I do wonder if we'll see her dealing with the after effects of that close proximity she had to Sauron as well. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how she deals with that and how that differs to how Celebrimbor deals with it.
Yeah, exactly. And like whether that's psychological, is Galadriel going to question herself, doubt herself, her methods? Obviously in season 1 we saw a pretty brutal side to her in terms of how she dealt with Adar and the orcs. Is that going to change? Is it going to get worse, better? All these sorts of things. So we'll talk about Galadriel a bit, but let's talk about Celebrimbor and Sauron, specifically in Eregion as Annatar. So we got 3 pictures from Collider, which was the first big drop of pictures. We get a picture of Celebrimbor standing at one of his smaller forges. Now, an interesting thing about the set design, because I'll just touch on this briefly and then we'll talk about the actual important parts of this. But if you look at these 3 pictures, I love that Celebrimbor has not only got this massive forge that we see in the shot from the trailer and the stuff in Empire magazine we saw, where it's a giant forge that Annatar can walk through the actual forge itself because it's so big. But if you look at these pictures, this is clearly taking place in his personal study or workshop. And he's even got his own little forge installed there. So even if while he's working or after he's had some lunch, he can just go over to his little forge and work on stuff without being in the main kind of workshop. I just kind of love. But yeah, so we get a picture of Celebrimbor in his green robe standing by the forge, clearly working. We then get a picture in the same room of Sauron in his Annatar form, and my God, I have to say I've never been that partial to Charlie Vickers, but he looks absolutely stunning as Annatar in this picture, and he's standing in the room. And then the most interesting picture is the 3rd picture. Now, in this picture, it's well, put it bluntly, it's Celebrimbor, but in the red robes we see from the trailer and from the Empire picture when Annatar comes through the forge in the blinding light. But standing opposite him is Sauron, but he's not in his Annatar form. He is in his Halbrand form, wearing the same robes he left Eregion in, looking quite greasy and battered and worn down. So, I'm not going to say what I think, first of all. Anna, I just want to get your thoughts. What does this mean?
See, I have got a very clear vision in my head of how this scene's going to play out. I don't know whether it's kind of wishful thinking, whether it's how I want it to play out, or whether I think it's how it's going to play out. But I think the one thing that I take from this is, even if you just compare it to the picture of Annatar standing there alone in his Annatar form, it's clearly the same scene as when he's standing there as Halbrand. You can tell by the kind of setup of the table and everything. And then you go back to the picture that we got from, I think it might have been the Empire article, where Celebrimbor, again in his red robes, was standing directly in front of Annatar. Mm-hmm. And this looks to be very much the same scene as this final picture of him and Halbrand here. So listen, in my mind, I know there's probably not going to be this big reveal of, oh, it was you the whole time. But I like the idea of we've got Halbrand here standing in the shadows. And if it helps anyone listening to kind of have the picture up in front of you, you have kind of Halbrand standing off to the side in the shadows, and Celebrimbor is standing nearer to the light. So I think that he's going to have this conversation with Halbrand, and he's going to slowly step into the light. And as he does, he's going to kind of reveal himself in his Annatar form. And I'm not saying that this is the first time Celebrimbor is going to see him as Annatar, because I do think he's going to appear to him in that kind of bathing of golden light. But I feel like this might be him kind of revealing to Celebrimbor that, oh, he has been here the whole time. And I really hope it does play out like that. Like he sort of sheds the Halbrand skin and becomes this vision of Annatar. And I think based on the pictures we've seen, it's quite likely that that could happen, but that's my little theory for the scene. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with you in the sense that I do think that this is all going to be the same sequence, in that we'll get Annatar arriving in the forge, blinding light, steps through, appears, and then maybe Celebrimbor will say, I know your, in a sort of Theoden to Eowyn way, I know your face, that very different context,
Halbrand.
but yeah, Halbrand, I know your face. But so I think that's going to happen. I think they're then, Annatar's going to say, come, let us talk. And they're going to go to Celebrimbor's private study, which is what this set looks like it is. And I think rather than him standing there as Halbrand and then, like you say, walk into the light and transform to Annatar, I think it's going to be the other way, where he'll, from the forge, where he appears in the blinding light as Annatar, I think they're going to go to the private study. He's going to be standing there, in this room with Celebrimbor, because he's still wearing the red robe, so I'm convinced. And it looks like it's nighttime because of the way the scene's lit. It almost looks like moonlight coming through the kind of shutters on the far side of the room. But I think, Celebrimbor was obviously going to... He wants an explanation because he recognizes the face, but he's saying, this guy's arrived saying he's Annatar, and I think he's actually going to transform into Halbrand, showing that it was him, basically showing that he is a Maiar who can take on different forms, and then he'll switch back into Annatar at the end of the conversation, or at the end of this part of the conversation. So that's how I think
like that.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No, I was just going to say, so I think that's how it'll play out, in the sense of he will turn into Halbrand to, in inverted commas, tell the truth. So he'll do it in a way to almost gain Celebrimbor's trust. So there's almost the deception is the fact he claims there's no deception. He's going to say, no, I'll be upfront with you. I was here as Halbrand. Now, we don't know what reason he's going to give, but I think that's how it'll play out.
You see, what I would like, even on top of that, is because we know that he is going to come to him almost as this angelic figure, and he might kind of announce himself as an emissary to the Valar. What I would like is that I know Celebrimbor is going to recognize his face eventually. They spent time together at the end of season 1, but whether it's through kind of a deception of Annatar or just this sheer shock of seeing this person come to him in such a dramatic way, even if Celebrimbor doesn't recognize him straight away, there is quite a physical shift from Halbrand to Annatar. There were a lot of people, as we said, who didn't recognize it as being the same actor at first. So I'd even like it if Celebrimbor is just so confused by this and he doesn't know what to think, and then Annatar just walks back into the shadows, and all of a sudden there's Halbrand and he knows who it is, and his guard just falls like a little bit. Even if it plays out sort of like that.
Yeah, no, I think we're close, is what I'm saying. I think we're close. Now, I will say other people have different theories. Transmyron, who I follow on Twitter, has a theory that actually Sauron's going to arrive first as Halbrand, because we've obviously seen shots of Halbrand in Mordor in the behind the scenes video. So I think their theory was essentially that he's going to come back to Eregion and say, Galadriel cast me out, but I cannot return to the Southlands because, it's been taken over, and he's going to come back all bedraggled and beaten up, kind of all busted up. He's going to, ask for sanctuary. And then he's going to, maybe the next night, he's going to transform as Annatar, and that's going to happen. I don't personally think that's what's going to happen, but I think it's a really interesting theory, because basically until we see it, you can look at this in one of two ways. How is Sauron going to try and manipulate Celebrimbor? Is it going to be by appealing through, sympathy and pity, and then go to the Annatar temptation and hubris? Or is he going to go first with the Annatar Lord of Gifts, but in order to cement his trust, be honest about the Halbrand thing? So I just wanted to raise that theory from Transmyron, because I think it's obviously different to ours, but I think it demonstrates that there are many approaches they can take in terms of how exactly Sauron will manipulate Celebrimbor.
Yeah, I like that theory as well. I think it's just wishful thinking, but I'm very cemented in what I think is going to happen. But I really like the kind of subversive, like the other side of that they've gone for. Because I like the idea that maybe if he appeared in his Halbrand form, and Celebrimbor still wasn't fully convinced. Maybe that's when he turns on Annatar and he just kind of blinds him with all of this power and this promise for riches and kind of power beyond belief. I think that's really interesting.
It would be really funny if he does come as Halbrand, and then Celebrimbor wakes up one night, sees that Halbrand's walking through the tower, follows him, and he's like, Halbrand, what are you doing? And Halbrand walks into the forge where we see the light, but he walks into the forge, then the light appears, and he walks back out like he's kind of doing, what was it? Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. Yeah, he's doing like a transformation, Sailor Moon transformation, where he's like, stay there a moment, Celebrimbor, I'll be right back. And then he like walks into the forge. Yeah, exactly. But that's just a funny thing. Anyway, sorry, you were going to say something else.
No, see, this is completely off topic, and like feel free to cut it out, but this is something that I've been thinking of when we talk about kind of Halbrand. Oh my god, I'm calling him Halbrand again. When we talk about Annatar and the things that he's going to be promising to Celebrimbor this season, we also know that Celebrimbor is going to kind of erect a statue of Feanor, and I wonder how much of a hand Annatar will have in him convincing him to kind of embrace that part of his kind of lineage and his nature. And I know that it has nothing really to do with this, but I do wonder how much that part of Celebrimbor's kind of family history will play into the deception and the kind of seduction.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously, to return to something we talked about at the top of the episode, we know that they've changed or improved a lot of the sets or expanded the sets in season 2. So it could be possible that within the show's universe, the statue of Feanor was always there. We just didn't see it in season 1. But I, like you, hope that it is a conscious thing that happens, because Annatar is basically telling Celebrimbor not to be ashamed of his legacy, not to think that he lives in the shadow of Feanor's legacy, but actually that he should strive to be more like Feanor and to eclipse Feanor. And so I agree with you. I hope we see that. I do think there's a chance that it's just going to have always been there. We won't have seen it in season 1, but like you said, I would love for that to be part of Celebrimbor's descent. So the only other things we really learn about Annatar, Celebrimbor, and Eregion in this scene are just some small details about the rings and the forge. So we won't spend long on this because we are trying to keep this episode slightly shorter. So we find out that while the design of the 3 elven rings has largely been set, obviously, from last season, we do know that they have basically done some additional improvement on them. Obviously, the forge has been redesigned for the new tower. But so this is a really interesting quote talking about how they do this. So this is from one of the articles. It says, the practicalities of making a TV show also require more than one real-life prop ring for every ring we see on screen. For close-up shots, any ring with a stone in it had to be made with a real stone, as in a gemstone, because otherwise the camera will pick up on any flaws or give away signs that the ring is made of something other than stone. And this is the quote from the crew. When a macro lens gets on them, it will pick out any tiny little imperfection, Foley explains. The team hired a jeweler to make those rings. And then there's a bad joke from the article writer who says, using, we presume, ruby and sapphire, but not mithril, as we have not heard of any Balrogs being disturbed in London lately. Oh. Anyway.
Listen, the dwarves in Khazad-dûm don't realise that they disturbed a Balrog, so who knows, we could have.
Who knows, indeed. But yes, we get some more details about the design of the rings. Foley also says that one of his team went out to different museums, including the British Museum, to photograph existing beautiful rings, and that they also used the art of John Howe, who's still working on the show. They used a combination of his designs and historical rings, so we assume this is for the 7 and the 9 rings that we'll see. But that's really all the detail we get on Annatar and Celebrimbor. Obviously, we got a lot in the Empire magazine, and they're going to want to keep some of this secret. And obviously, if you want to read more about the filming of the Eregion battle, there's plenty in these articles, but as it's just a set report, I didn't want to spend this episode just talking about the mud and the bodies and the stunt work and all that, because it's a bit repetitive. But if you want to read that, check out the links to the articles in the show notes. With that, should we briefly touch on the 2 elves that we still haven't got a lot about, Elrond and Gil-galad? And I don't know whether you want to talk about the quote about Elrond or maybe the picture of Elrond, wherever you'd like to start, Anna.
I'll start with the picture because I know we did touch upon his armor last week, but we've now got kind of a lot of a clearer picture of it. And I just don't think I can echo how intricate and incredible this armor is. I mean, the first thing that really jumps out to me here is just the really striking intermingling of silver and gold for Laurelin and Telperion. It's just, oh, it's so well done. And then you have obviously the feathers on his shoulders in reference to Elwing. And I also really like the fact that his horse also seems to have kind of a similar matching armor. And it's something that we'll talk about a bit later, you know, a quote that you sent me about the horses having this kind of their own specialized looks, but I like the kind of consistency with this. I also really, really like his helmet. I don't think we've really seen a design like this so far in the Rings of Power, and I really like what they've done with it, and the kind of cloak over one shoulder as well. There's just so many small details here, but it's an incredibly well done piece of armor. Even the horse has its own little kind of thing to match Elrond's helmet. It's insane.
Yeah, the horse has got a kind of armored piece on its head, and it's got almost a crest which looks like the reverse of Elrond's crest. But I mean, for any of you who haven't, you can find these pictures on my Twitter account. But if you go on and zoom in to the main picture, because it's such a high resolution picture, you can pick up some amazing details. So, for example, if you zoom in on the shoulder guard, there's chipped paint. The silver and gold, some of it's chipped on the shoulder, which implies perhaps that this armor that Elrond's used before, or perhaps he's inherited it, which would be very interesting. You can see that even the buckles on his, what I think would be a gambeson, the kind of padded shirt that would go under the chest plate. If you zoom in on that, you can see even the buckles which would fasten that are in the shape of stars, which is just amazing. His saddle has an incredibly intricate kind of swirl design. His sword, which you can kind of see the pommel and the hilt of, there's almost this leaf pattern which is worked into both the grip of the sword and the pommel, these kind of golden overlapping leaves, which are just gorgeous. So when Anna's talking about the detail that goes into this, and again, it goes back to that quote that the costume designer said in the article we referenced earlier. A lot of this you won't even see on screen, or you won't even realize you're seeing, but by going to this level of detail, it just enhances it both for the actor but as for the viewer. And you don't necessarily need a close-up, because it's just that sense that this is a real crafted piece of armor.
Yeah, and I don't mean to kind of disparage anyone else, because I'm a fan of the kind of A Song of Ice and Fire universe, and I've been watching The House of the Dragon as it goes on, and I do really enjoy it. But one thing that I find myself kind of subconsciously comparing is the armor in both shows. Because I don't know what the production is like behind the scenes of The House of the Dragon. You know, I've not read up about it like I do with The Rings of Power, but what I've noticed is that there's a lot of inconsistency with the detail that goes into pieces of armor for various characters in the show. Someone will have kind of a very plain piece of armor that doesn't look like there's been kind of a lot of thought put into it, and that's just my own perception from an outside viewer, so I could be wrong. But everything that we've seen from the Rings of Power, you know, they're telling us a story through this armor. We can see Elrond's kind of heritage in this. We've got the two trees. Even his horse has this kind of protection on it. There's so much storytelling going on through the costuming here. And I think it's something that's always happened in the Rings of Power, but I don't think that there's ever really been any inconsistencies in the costuming. You know, they don't kind of put effort into one thing and draw back on something else. It's very consistent in that aspect, I think.
You know, it's even for the pieces of armor that people weren't fans of, like even the Númenor armor in season 1, they were very deliberate choices. The lightweight armor, the scales, the fact that around the collars of, say, Elrond's armor and the Sea God, they had depictions of Uinen and Osse, the two Maiar of the sea, across from the sun of Númenor emblazoned on the center. All these small details, you know, the wings of the helmet, which are reminiscent of the Gondorian helmets, but also of Tolkien's own art. You know, Tolkien himself was an illustrator, and even the wings on the helmets are reminiscent of Tolkien's own designs. So there's so much in there where you can see the thought has been put into it. And like you say, neither of us read up on the production of House of the Dragon, but you can just tell the difference in the. And by the way, House of the Dragon in season 1, I remember the Valarian, I think it was Corlys, had an amazing piece of intricate armor.
Incredible.
And so that show has done similarly good things, but it's the consistency for me of application when it comes to costume design and armor design in particular that I really appreciate. So that's the picture of Elrond we got. We also got a couple of pieces of information, one which is a quote and one which is a fun fact. So the quote is Patrick McKay about how Elrond feels about Galadriel's betrayal of trust. Obviously, at the end of season 1, Elrond realizes that Galadriel has hidden something about Halbrand and who he is. And Patrick McKay says on Elrond, what does it mean for the rest of the elves? How does Elrond feel about that? Elrond loves her and trusted her and was worried about her, and everything he feared came true. And it's a lot worse, potentially. So what's going to happen when he finds that out? Let's talk about that briefly. One of the big things we've wondered is, how does that relationship evolve? And we see that Elrond is clearly going on Galadriel's quest because he's part of her company when we see the scene with the Barrow-wights. But I don't think it's going to be... And I think this is where we might see, not Elrond outgrow her, but start to pull away from... in season 1, he had a very deferential view of her. I think season 2, we might see Elrond grow into his own position as a leader, partly because he feels that he can't rely on everyone else, and in particular, he can't rely on Galadriel.
Yeah, I mean, as a retired English lit student, the first thing I noticed from that quote was when he talks about Elrond and Galadriel, he says Elrond loves her, present tense, and trusted her, past tense. And I think that dynamic that they're going to play into is really interesting because, of course, he still loves her. They're very, very close friends, but the trust isn't there. And how is that going to play out with him as a member of her company? And I think that that's going to be something that we can talk about maybe a bit more when we get onto Galadriel herself. But will people start to kind of second guess her leadership and her decisions? How will Elrond kind of deal with that from his perspective of someone who still loves her? He still loves and respects her as a person, but her choices and everything that's happened so far, that trust is gone. So will that affect kind of how they interact with each other personally, but also on the battlefield? Because if you're being led by someone, you have to trust them. There's no other way around it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be fascinating to see play out. The other thing we read in the IGN article is that there is and this is a bit of a spoiler, so just tune out for a minute or two if you don't want to hear about this, but there is a specific stunt for Rob Aramayo where Elrond is cornered and jumps from a 50-foot waterfall. What's he running from? I mean, I don't have much speculation on this, except to say it reminds me of the, I think it came out in the year 2000, the Angelina Jolie Lara Croft Tomb Raider film. And there's a scene where she's pursued by Daniel Craig's character, and then she just does this kind of backwards dive off a waterfall to escape. And so I just thought, I'm quite excited to see that. And who knows when it happens? Is it when he separates from Galadriel's quest? Is it post-Eregion? Who knows? But fair play to Rob Aramayo for actually diving off a waterfall.
No, I like the idea of as well that they talked about the actors doing their own stunts, because in my mind they're just like, yeah, so Robert Aramayo actually did jump 50 foot off a waterfall. he can just do that. He's that talented.
He is an elf, actually. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, I think that's really good. I'm glad that he's getting a bit more of a actiony, heroic role in season 2, because he was very much the quote-unquote politician in season 1, so it's nice to see him kind of step up in that way. And it'll be nice. I know a lot of people want to see him covered in blood. I might be one of them.
Who knows? Who can say? But yeah, obviously we read in the article that he's going to do a lot more horseback riding, a lot more hand-to-hand combat, so that'd be great. And then the other elf we haven't touched on, we did a little bit at the start, and to be honest, that's because we don't have much to say. I've titled this section, "They Still Won't Tell Us Anything About Gil-galad." But the one thing we did get was a new picture of him. I think this came out on Friday, which was, so this didn't come out with the other articles, and it's a picture of Gil-galad sitting at a desk, and he's got quill and parchment in front of him, and he's wearing a version of his gold robes. I think these might be new robes compared to season 1, but they look very comfy, so I suggested they might be his pajamas. But also they're very intricate. It's got his sigil of the kind of field of stars on the right arm, and he's wearing his crown on his head. So there's not too much we can infer from this. I've got one theory about it, but I'll save. But Anna, I know you wanted to talk about one thing about Gil-galad in this picture, which is his hairstyle.
Yes, so I'll always be very forward with the things that I don't like about the Rings of Power. I'm like you, Harry. I've been called a shill numerous times. However, if there's something that I'm not a huge fan of, I will just say it. And this new kind of undercut hairstyle that they've given him, from what I've seen so far, it doesn't really work for me. But again, this could be similar to how I feel about Adar, where I've only seen him in very singular, well lit, kind of almost behind the scenes shots. We're seeing them in very still images, and there's not a lot of movement or anything to kind of compare it to. However, I'm not a fan of the new wig he's been given this season, and I know you said, Harry, that he talked about it being kind of how Gil-galad prepares himself for battle. So that gives me hope that at least this means we will be seeing him in battle, hopefully armored. But yeah, the stills that we've been getting of it, something about it just looks a bit wrong to me. Like there should just be something here, and there isn't.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't give any of the elves sideburns in season 1, and that was a specific decision to accentuate the ears. But this is obviously a much more extreme cut. I mean, just to give you guys an idea of what Anna's initial reaction was, I got texts from Anna that said, "I am not one to disparage elves' hair. However, what did they do to him? He looks like he's just been to the barber's and asked for a fade." So when Anna says she really wasn't a fan of it, she wasn't joking. I mean, I'm kind of with you on this, Anna. I think it might be like Adar, where we've seen so little of him in the season 2 promotional footage, and this angle in particular, it's a very side-on profile angle, so it's going to accentuate that even more. And we know he's going to wear his hair in a braid at least one point in the season, so I think it might look somewhat better when he's wearing a braid, and so that undercut almost kind of accentuates how martial and militaristic he'll look. But it's an interesting look, to say the least. I completely understand why you wouldn't be a fan of it. Now, the only thing I'll say about this letter, what looks like, who knows if he's writing a letter, but I'm speculating here. If he is writing a letter, there's, in the tale of Aldarion and Arendis in Unfinished Tales, there is a moment, and I think it's referenced in the Silmarillion as well, there is a moment when Sauron has kind of risen back to power and the elves have become aware of him, where Gil-galad, who's friends with the Númenorians for part of the history of the Second Age, writes a letter. And this is the relevant quote, so I'll just pull this up for anyone listening. So this comes from Unfinished Tales. So the quote goes, "When Aldarion left the chamber, Meneldor looked at the letter that his son had given him, wondering, for he saw that it came from King Gil-galad in Lindon. It was sealed and bore his device of white stars upon a blue rondure." Now, in the Unfinished Tales, you can actually, if you want, go and read the full letter, but it's basically Gil-galad asking for help. Now, the thing that happens in the canon, and obviously in the books, this is all taking place over hundreds of years, so it's never going to translate to the show in the same way. But at first, basically, the Númenorians don't come to his aid because they receive it too late, and then they're slow to act. But eventually, in the story, and this is a mild spoiler, although not really for future seasons, the Númenorians will be coming to Middle-earth to the elves' aid, and it may start off good and end badly. We'll have to see. But I do, and this is total speculation based on one image, but I do wonder if Gil-galad is going to send a letter to the Númenorians asking for help, and help won't come before Eregion is attacked. And that will be a way to explore what's happening in Númenor in terms of the change in politics from when Miriel did send help to how perhaps whoever's in charge of Númenor in season 2 chooses to respond. But big speculation there, and let's perhaps save the rest of that discussion for the Númenor section.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing I have to say is just please give us some more Gil-galad content. Please.
Yeah.
We're being starved.
Yeah, between Gil-galad and Elendil, which we'll get on to later. You're really hurting Anna here, guys. So,
you are.
Seeing as we've talked about Sauron and we've talked about the other elves, there's only one place for us to logically go. And that's to two of Anna's favourite characters, one, of course, being Adar, or as I put it in this preparation document, Adad-ar and his children. Ha ha ha. Yes, thank you. And also talking about Galadriel. So we don't get too much news about Adar. Obviously, we've had the interview with Sam Hazeldine in the past. We've had some more in the Empire feature. Just a couple of things we do here. So we find out that we will get a more intimate look at Adar early on and understand his relationship with the orcs. Speaking speaking of Adar, he's stronger than ever in Season 2, but now he has a lot more of his children to protect and a lot more to lose. So that implies two things. One, that we'll see in the Sauron prologue more about Adar, and also that obviously in Season 2, Adar is going to be, he's gone from a regional assistant manager to being, a general manager of quite a large workforce. And the other thing we find out about the set that obviously we've seen in the behind the scenes and some of the pictures is kind of the new Mordor set where Adar and his orcs are living. And we get this description from the Den of Geek set visit. But while the weather may have helped pile on the authentic mud, that First World War vibe is very much a deliberate artistic choice as well. Once we've got back to the main studio and dried off, we are shown a miniature model used in designing Adar's orc encampment for Season 2. This looks even more like the Western Front in World War One, as it's full of trenches and ladders, and if it weren't for the orcs and the lack of tanks, it could almost be a historical set. Now, we've talked a lot about set design, but I have to say, considering all we saw in Season 1 was just those kind of quite basic tunnels, I'm very excited to see what they do here, and especially with the picture of Adar and Galadriel we'll get onto in a minute. I'm just very excited and love that they're quite correctly referencing World War One as an inspiration for Mordor, because for Tolkien, obviously, there were similarities there.
I mean, yeah, I've already touched on this before, but just the kind of broadness of where they're getting all their inspirations from is just incredible. I feel like we're going to be so immersed in these sets, and it's stuff, as you said, we saw kind of the surface of, well, not the surface because they were underground, but the surface of Adar's encampment in Season 1. So we're going to just kind of go more into these sets and kind of, as it says here, get a more intimate look at the characters, which I think is really good. There's two things that I kind of took from this, and one of them just references what we talked about before, so I'll talk about that first. And it's the idea of this kind of Ides of March-esque revolt against Sauron that Adar partakes in. And listen, you've got to give me my moment for a bit of wild speculation here, because we talked last time or the time before about, we actually made a bet on whether we think Adar will make it to the end of Season 2 into Season 3, and I do think that he's going to die in this season. And what I think we're going to see is, obviously there's going to be this sort of struggle for power over the orcs between Sauron and Adar, because they both have very different relationships. There's force and then there's love and respect. And I think we're going to see this kind of intimate relationship between him and his children in the prologue, and that's what leads up to this kind of revolt against Sauron. I think that by the time we get to the end of Season 2, they're going to kind of turn that on their head, and Sauron is going to kind of get his footing back as the leader of the orcs, and it's almost going to be kind of a mirror of the prologue, and that's how Adar is going to die. It's going to be this sort of, he turns the orcs on their father almost. I don't know how that will play out, but I would love for something like that to happen, just kind of mirror the way he kills Sauron in the end. That's what I got from this kind of Ides of March thing. But again, that's my wild speculation.
I mean, if they do that, as much as I've bet that Adar will survive into Season 3, if they are going to kill him off, that is a perfect way. I mean, imagine how horrifying that would be if Adar is betrayed by his own children. And it also makes me think about some of the other things that have been referenced in these articles that makes me think that Adar might be attacking Eregion, not because Sauron has told him to, because Sauron's in charge, but because Sauron has manipulated him into thinking that's the right thing to do. And so I wonder even whether for most of Season 2, Sauron isn't really in charge, in quotation marks, of Adar and the orcs, but he's in different ways manipulating them. And that's why we're going to have Galadriel and Adar come together, because it's going to allow us to see how Sauron has manipulated Adar into thinking the thing he needs to do is attack Eregion. Now, I don't know what he's going to have told Adar or manipulate him into thinking which is going to get Adar to do that. Maybe it's going to be the idea of a preemptive strike. The elves are building up their power, and if you let them, they're going to come back to Mordor and wipe you out. Maybe he's even going to go as far as somehow make Adar believe that Sauron has returned and is working with the elves in Eregion, and that is going to make Adar go, well, I'm going to kill him properly this time, and so he's going to attack Eregion of his own volition. I know. Now, I could be wrong, and perhaps Sauron is going to take back control and he is going to order Adar more directly to attack Eregion. But I just think it's fascinating because all the quotes we've had about Sauron in these articles is the idea that he manipulates others to do what he wants. He's got no power, he's got no weapons, so it's all about manipulation and pushing people down a dark path. So I'm just saying it's a possibility.
No, I like that because, for a lot of people, season 1 ended very badly. But for Adar, it ended quite brilliantly, really. He achieved everything he set out to. He created Mordor, so he's got this sort of illusion of power now, and he's not. He might not be ready to give that up. So if Sauron plays into that, whether it's as Sauron or as this kind of mysterious figure, I think that would be very interesting. And I do, because I've been thinking of Adar attacking Eregion as a command, but I really do like the idea that he thinks that it's his plan and Sauron's just planted this kind of little seed in his head. I think that would be really good to see that play out. And, he's going to lose his own children in the attack as well, so it's going to take a toll.
Exactly, and especially because we know how Sauron's going to return to Mordor in his Halbrand form. That's, I think, when we'll know which way they're going with the story. Does he return to Mordor in his Halbrand form, transform into Sauron, and reassert control? Or does he, as Halbrand, plant the seeds that are going to lead to Adar attacking Eregion of his own volition? And how does Galadriel play into that? And that's where we'll transition into Galadriel by saying the other picture we got was, of course, of Galadriel and Adar sitting at a table across from each other, very much Pirates of the Caribbean, Captain Barbossa and Elizabeth Swann, that scene from the first film. But we'd heard rumors about this. I think it was Fellowship fans who'd leaked that there was that they'd heard that Galadriel would be captured by Adar at some point in season 2. Now, she doesn't look very much like she's captured, but perhaps this is just how Adar treats her, in the way that she had him in chains and treated him pretty terribly and, was treating him like a caged animal. I wonder whether this is, part of the thing, that Adar isn't going to treat her in the way she'd expect. And again, it's just this kind of subverting expectations. So what was your first thought when you saw this image?
I mean, as far as theories go about how this comes about and what they discuss, I'm honestly not too sure, so I'm not really going to speculate on that. But I will say that the conversation between Galadriel and Adar in season 1, where he does have her, she has him chained up, is one of my favourite moments in the whole season, and it's got some of my favourite dialogue and character moments. And I think that I would love to see that mirrored with the characters being kind of a bit further on in their arcs. We don't know how early or late on in the season this happens, so we don't know what's going to have occurred by this point. But I like the idea of getting these two characters back together because I think that they played really well off each other, especially, when Adar kind of hits Galadriel with this, you need to look in the mirror. That's where your journey needs to start, is in the mirror. And that was, I think, a really big moment for her character in season 1. And I'd just like to see, as I said, I don't know what they're going to be talking about. I did make a joke that they would just be gossiping about Sauron. So maybe that's the case. But I'm very excited to see the dynamic between those two characters again, especially with, she had the upper hand last time. Maybe not because kind of Adar twisted it on her in the end, but she's now in this position where if she's been captured, she's at the mercy of him and his children. So I don't know whether that will change the way she interacts with them. But what we know from the Rings of Power Galadriel, at least in season 1, is that she's very brash and she will say what she thinks, whether it's at her own peril. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Just to turn to kind of Galadriel's character arc across the season, there's some interesting things to think about. Patrick McKay and JD Payne give two very interesting quotes. McKay talks about the fact that in season 1, Galadriel, who in our estimation is one of the great heroes of Middle-earth, her pride and her PTSD were a crack that Sauron could get into and manipulate her to get everything he wanted. By the way, two things. One, talking about her PTSD and her trauma was one of my hobby horses in season 1, so I'm glad to see they're continuing with that. And two, very explicitly says that Sauron used that crack and that vulnerability to get into and manipulate her. Once again, I'm going back to my point that scene in the Forge where he's talking about her brother and feeling sorry for her, it was BS, and Sauron has been manipulated. And I'm perfectly fine with people who still think he was trying to redeem himself, but that doesn't excuse the fact he was very much manipulating her. And the second point I'll raise that JD Payne brings up is he says, Galadriel made some pretty questionable choices in Season 1 and really empowered the Dark Lord to rise from nothing on the raft to the point where he could, as Patrick said, have access to some of the big power plays in Middle-earth. She's got to deal with that in Season 2. And then he says, her friends might look at her differently and not trust her as much, and then she really has to come to terms with that. So I think Season 2 is going to be a huge season for Galadriel's journey of self-reflection, character development, her moral compass, what she's trying to do and why she's trying to do it. And we talked about this on the last episode in terms of moving away from revenge and into protecting Middle-earth. But as we've kind of talked about throughout this episode, another thing that's just made me very optimistic about where they're going with her in Season 2.
I agree. And I think something that I find really interesting about this is the trust people will have in her. And I know we touched on this with Elrond, because she is, in Season 1, she is the commander of Gil-galad's northern armies. She has this leadership role, and she's going to have to deal with the mistrust of the people around her. Something that I would love them to lean into, that I don't know if they will, but I think, I don't know whether it's in the Silmarillion or the Unfinished Tales, but Tolkien is very clear that Galadriel has the desire to have a realm of her own and rule herself. And that's part of what played into Sauron's offer at the end of Season 1. That's what he approaches her with when he's revealed, is this offer of power to serve alongside him as like a queen. And that is a really big part of Galadriel's character. And as she goes further into Season 2, she's obviously repentant. She knows that what she did, she knows that she made a mistake kind of trusting him, but she's not going to be kind of completely a different person overnight. So I wonder if this kind of mistrust of the people around her and having to kind of reform her friendships, I wonder if there'll be moments where she kind of laments rejecting the offer of power. That is one of her desires, and she had it kind of within her grasp. And I'm not saying that she's going to sit there and be like, wow, I should have sided with the Dark Lord, but whether it'll kind of occur to her that she had that much power in her grasp and she let it slip away, and she's almost kind of back at square one now because of all the mistakes she made in that. I think it's a really interesting thing they could lean into.
Yeah, and I think her having a ring of power as well, how's that going to play into it? Even in the other picture we got of her, which is a gorgeous picture of her walking through the brush. So this is some of the location filming. She's wearing her kind of, I'm going to call it her hunter questing outfit. She's got her grey robes, her chainmail, her bow. You can also zoom in and see on her left hand that she has got Nenya on her left hand. So that was one of the questions I had. Would she still be carrying the ring out on her quest? And it turns out she is. So my big question is, does she still have it on her when she's captured by Adar? If that's what happens, obviously a rumor, but we have now this picture of the two of them together. So whether she willingly lets herself get captured, maybe to try and undermine Sauron, to try and, exploit Adar's own hatred towards Sauron, I don't know, but very interesting that she will be carrying Nenya, and interesting to see how that plays into her journey in Season 2.
I mean, yeah, I know we've always known that Galadriel is a ring bearer. She is the bearer of Nenya, but it is interesting if you take into perspective that she's not trusted anymore by the people around her in this season. And it does, I don't know if we kind of see the creation of the rings at the end of Season 1. I actually can't remember whether we see them being given out, but I wonder whether there is any hesitance of the characters to give her that ring of the ring of power based on her actions in the previous season, because they make it very clear that she's not trusted anymore. However, she is still given this position as a ring bearer.
Well, that's the thing. Obviously, at the end of Season 1, we see the three rings, and then it cuts to Sauron in Mordor. Now, we assume at the start of Season 2, Elrond and Galadriel are going to ride to Lindon to Gil-galad, because obviously these rings were designed to be the solution to the elves fading, the blight on the trees, all that. Now, I wonder whether, despite her mistakes, obviously Gil-galad probably thinks, I'm not going to give her a ring, and I wonder whether, because Círdan has foresight more than any of the others, I wonder whether he's the one to suggest that Galadriel should still receive a ring, because with his foresight greater than any other elf, he's going to know how important it is for her to receive one. Now, that's complete headcanon, but like you say, and
it makes sense.
Yeah, we didn't really touch on this earlier either, but how does Celebrimbor feel about the fact he's made these 3 rings and then they're immediately taken away from him and given to other people? I think that is another area that Annatar can exploit. So I think how the rings are used, they're probably not going to give away much of that in the promo, but I think that'll be something we need to keep thinking about and watch for. Now, we've got to move on because we're not really keeping to our idea of keeping this to a shorter episode. So we're going to briefly cover Khazad-dûm. Not too much new information in here. We knew a lot of the things that are talked about. Just on the set part, we do get some information that it's obviously been expanded like all the other sets. So we have Christian Milstead talking about the idea that even Khazad-dûm gets a twist. We're going to make it more sinister, make it more dark, and even uses this idea that the dwarves and the elves, the storyline this season is about greed. It's about this idea of wanting more and delving deeper. And JD Payne says this. He says, we're also finding the new within where we've already been. The dwarves are going to be digging deeper and going to new parts of Khazad-dûm we haven't seen before. And some of the things we know have been redesigned. We know King Doran's throne's been redesigned, and we get a picture of that. So I'm not sure whether that's going to be something that's addressed in the show or just it's going to be a redesign. But it would be interesting if that was caused by the rings. He upgrades his throne room. And we also find out, Owain Arthur says that we're going to see different parts of Khazad-dûm. We're going to see a softer side of dwarven society. And we also get some quotes from Owain Arthur about his and Disa's relationship. And I just want to pick up on this one because I think it's just beautiful. He says, they love each other like a furnace. It's unstoppable. The passion they have for each other and the love they have and the respect that they have for each other, it's just there the whole time. Now, I'll just say this. One day, I hope I meet someone who I can describe has a love for each other like a furnace. Because, my God, talk about the most romantic way you could describe a couple. It's wonderful.
It's quite funny that you say that you would like that, because I feel like that's sort of how Celebrimbor could possibly describe a love as well, except maybe he would use the word forge instead of furnace.
Perhaps,
but
yes.
No, it's really nice, and there were really a few nice quotes in there, especially about Durin and Disa, and it's nice that they're going to get closer as he kind of gets further away from his father. Something that I wondered about is one of our least favourite things from season 1, which was the inclusion of the Balrog. When Durin makes the decision to kind of mine for the Mithril, is a leaf falls and awakens the Balrog, something obviously we weren't very happy with. Have they backed themselves into a bit of a corner there? Because they talk here about the dwarves. Obviously, their greed is only increased tenfold by the Ring of Power. So they're delving deeper into the mountain. They're delving deeper into parts of Khazad-dûm they hadn't before. If the Balrog was awoken by a rogue leaf, how can they do this without that being more of a problem this season?
I have no effing idea. It makes no sense. Listen, all I'm going to say is that particular spot where King Doran dropped the leaf was like an elevator shaft. It went directly to the very bottom of Khazad-dûm. So they're not going to remine that part. They're going to go mine a different part. I assume. Listen, I have no idea how it works. I don't want to see the Balrog reappear in season 2, but also I don't know how that works. So, but listen, I am excited. I am excited to see what they do with it. And one thing that I hadn't really touched on, when we got the behind the scenes video with the teaser trailer, there was a clip of Celebrimbor and Durin. And at first, I thought that took place in Khazad-dûm because the architecture behind Celebrimbor and Durin looked that kind of angular triangles and, almost the geometric design they use for Khazad-dûm. But it actually, I can't remember who it was, someone posted it on Twitter, it matches the backdrop we see in some of the other shots from the behind the scenes of Eregion. So I know he hasn't been revealed yet, but just a thing to think about. We have heard that Na'vi might be appearing in season 2. So what I would love is if we see Na'vi, as well as making the Doors of Durin in Khazad-dûm, I would love if we start to see Na'vi's architectural influences on Eregion as well. It's got nothing to do with what was in any of these articles. We didn't hear anything about Na'vi, but there's a lot of stuff in here about the relationship between the dwarves and the elves and greed and all these things. And so that's just something I wanted to bring up. I'm excited to see not only how, as Owain Arthur talks about, Durin and Disa, the strain that Durin's under after being disavowed by his father, but I'm also interested to see how that interlinks with Celebrimbor, Annatar, and Eregion.
I agree, and I'm just very happy that they're still leaning into this softer side of dwarven society, because we know from a lot of adaptation that Tolkien dwarves tend to kind of get the brunt of being the comedic relief and not being taken as very serious characters. Even in The Hobbit, which was kind of focused on the dwarven company, they were still kind of treated as this comedic relief. That's one thing that I thought they did really well in season 1, because they still had these moments of comedy. Durin and Disa, they are comedic characters. Sophia and Owain, they're very naturally funny people, and that comes through, I think, as they play it. But some of the most poignant moments from season 1 took place between the dwarves and the elves. I think that really helped in their relationship with Elrond. And if we see that more with Narvi and Celebrimbor in season 2, I think that just adds a lot more layers to the dwarven society. And I think I really liked how they did it in season 1, so I'm very confident that they'll kind of continue that into season 2.
Agreed. Well, I know, guys, listening, that was only a short section on Khazad-dûm, but there really wasn't a lot of new information in these articles. And onto another section, we didn't really get any new information, but we got 2 pictures. So we're returning to our policemen of Pelargir, Arondir and Isildur. We got 2 new pictures of Arondir. We got a picture of Arondir in the woods, looks like the same scene from the trailer where he flips over the car, and he's wearing a wire and he's holding a stunt bow in this picture, so we assume that's for that film here. But the second picture is the more interesting one, because we get a picture of Arondir, and it's almost bluish grey light, but that's partly because of his surroundings. He's surrounded by these arches, which a friend of ours on Twitter, Holly, said reminded her of the Osgiliath designs from Peter Jackson films, and it very much to me does remind me of that blend of kind of elven and Númenorian architecture. Now, as we know from within the show's timeline, Pelargir is an old Númenorian colony, so we don't know yet whether it's been abandoned and then reclaimed by the Southlanders, whether there are still some descendants of Númenorian colonists there, but we knew that's where the Southlanders were heading, and this is really our first picture of it. Now, I think Fellowship fans had some leaked set pictures of this set, but this is the first time we've seen it in official promo footage, and it looks great. I mean, like I said, it's very reminiscent of the kind of Gondorian, Osgiliath, pre-Gondorian designs we've seen in the films, and I've got no problem with them taking inspiration from that. And then we get a quote from Patrick McKay on this. So he says, "The Southlanders are last seen going to Pelargir, an old Númenorian colony, so that's going to be a whole new location. We know that's a place that has a significant destiny in the Legendarium and how the colonies of Middle-earth relate back to the parent country back in Númenor. So that's a story that's kicking off. We love the idea of an old Númenorian colony that had become adapted to Southlander life. And what might that look like? It's quite rugged the way that the world tends to be, and really beautifully designed." So, Anna, both on just kind of this picture of Pelargir and McKay's quote, and I think most interestingly, the bit where he says how that relates back to the parent country in Númenor. So what that might mean for how Númenor is going to approach its past colonies and maybe its future colonies. I think while it's a very short piece of insight, it's very interesting.
I mean, I think, as you said, that we didn't get a lot about Pelargir, but one of the things that we've kind of discussed is how they will portray it as, and how the portrayal of Pelargir will aid to portray the portrayal of Númenor as a colonizer, because that's essentially what they are at this point in time. And they use the word colonies of Middle-earth, relating back to the parent country. But I do wonder kind of in what light they'll paint the Númenorian presence in Middle-earth as. I don't think they've given a lot away here, so I'm still a bit kind of in the middle. I can't really tell what way they're going to go here, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that yourself.
Yeah, I think in a weird way, the colony, because it's abandoned, or it appears to be abandoned, it's at least old. I think it'll almost be value neutral at this point and kind of be a relic. So it won't be a positive or negative in a sense, but perhaps we might hear the Southlanders describe it in a negative way. Perhaps the reason the Southlanders were in Mordor, perhaps the reason they settled there is because the Númenorians settled the coastline and took the good land for themselves. And that's why the Southlanders didn't live on the coasts, because the Númenorians had colonized it. So that could be really interesting. But even if they don't portray it in that negative light at this point, the reason that could still be good is because it opens up for when, Númenor sees a change of foreign policy under what we're going to be talking about next. We're going to see those colonies change from being something that, while you could still describe as imperialism, to change to a very different aspect in Númenor, going there to dominate, to grab land, to colonize, and to see themselves as the rulers of not just Númenor, but of the men of Middle-earth as well. I think season 2 could be using it as a great staging point to then show how Númenor changes from the following season onwards.
Yeah, so I think Arondir is one of those characters that we've not gotten too much about. We've got a few pictures, a few quotes about the behind the scenes, but there's not much to go on. Something that I have noticed, though, is that we've had pictures of Arondir, we've had pictures of Arondir with Estrid and Isildur. We've not seen much of Arondir with Theo. I don't know whether that's kind of a conscious choice or not something that they've just deigned to show us yet, but, we know that Bronwyn isn't going to be around anymore, so I wonder kind of what his relationship with Theo is going to be like. It might just be that there's not really much content between the two to give us as promotional material, but it does feel quite strange that we've just not seen them together really this season.
Yeah, and I think bringing in Isildur here, we only really got one piece of Isildur information. So we got a picture of him, and he's wearing a different outfit. So this is the one we've seen in some of the behind-the-scenes videos, less so in the trailer, where he's wearing just kind of this fairly plain tunic, a quite raggedy old cloak. He's holding a torch, and he's surrounded by other men dressed in kind of similar, simple garb. And the quotes we get from the article include, "It was also noted that scragglers throughout the countryside who haven't been killed or escaped probably have pretty hard choices ahead of them." And then another article says, "We left quite a few Southlanders in the Ash of Mordor in season 1, along with Arondir and the plot-armored Isildur, so it feels safe to assume that we're not starting with them in a great place this year." So I think, like you say, sounds like Theo, Arondir, Isildur, Estrid, who obviously we met in our last episode. It's going to be interesting to see how that's handled, and it's going to be interesting to see. This very much feels like a story of survival and hard choices. And as we've talked about previously, while that will probably impact Theo and it will impact Arondir, I think most harshly of all it's going to affect Isildur, because he's always lived a pretty privileged life. So what's it going to be like when he's having to be a survivor and all he's faced with are hard choices?
Yeah, and I like that he's kind of going down the Aragorn route of never having a shower. But at the same time, he looks good while he's doing it, so can we complain? No.
Exactly. And the last thing we got, which I just thought was funny to include, there was a note in, I think it was the IGN article, which said, "For all the horse girlies and guys out there, you should know that each horse in season 2 has their own specific look for new characters." So, not really sure who that's in reference to, because new characters, I guess that could be Estrid, that could be Círdan, I guess, but it's just interesting to know they're even paying attention to the look of the horses. So, a rare peace treaty with the horse girls, to say that's interesting. So that's all we're going to say about Pelargir, because there's not a lot to say, and this episode is once again getting out of hand in terms of length. But let's talk about Númenor, which in previous episodes we haven't had much to talk about, but this week we obviously have a bit more, because we got quite a bit on the set design, we got quite a bit on, in particular, Miriel and Pharazôn's story. So from the set design, we've kind of talked about a lot of this, but much like the other sets, it's got bigger, it's got more impressive. So in particular, the court set has had some changes. It's been made slightly bigger. They've increased the amount of gilding, bigger lights. They've changed the design of the pools, because apparently some people kept falling into them, according to Tristan Gravel, who plays Pharazôn. But one of the most interesting changes, and it's not huge, but I just think it's an interesting choice, was that Christian Milstead, the production designer, said, "One addition to Royal Court that might be visible on screen is a small shrine that has been added in the corner of the set, making it feel like a temple or a church. Production designer Christian Milstead tells us that the design of the shrine was inspired by an Eastern European church, and that these scouts specifically were I think it says a brutalist church in Romania. So shout out to our friend Susie, I guess, for the Romania reference. But just interesting that they're continuing to just do little tweaks on the sets. And obviously we got that picture of Pharazôn and Kemen in the new set. And I think it's very interesting just incorporating a bit of pseudo-religious imagery, given, the divide between the faithful and the kingsmen that we're going to be exploring. So putting that inside the court feels like quite a conscious choice.
What I really like about this, and I think I've talked about it a bit, is that they're improving things that technically don't need to be improved. Like, I thought the Númenor set, particularly like the kind of courtroom where Miriel and Pharazôn preside over, I thought that was really well done in season one. You know, it felt like a very real and lived in set, and I think that was a lot because of how kind of busy it was. But that's something that they've taken and they've said, how can we make this better? Which is just incredible. It just kind of shows that the work is just kind of ongoing behind the scenes. A quote that I really like is from Tristan himself, and I'm just going to kind of read the whole thing out. He says, "It's absolutely wonderful when the royal court fills up. I love that. It's like a bear pit. I worked at the Globe Theatre for 3 years, and it felt like that, you know, because it's in the round. Everything is just really lucid, and you either let it swallow you up or you really give it some and take the bull by the horns." And I love the comparison to the Globe Theatre because it's got that kind of round shape. It's very full and lively and bustling. And that's how I felt about it in season one. So I can only imagine like how much more real and lived in it's going to feel in season two. I'm very excited for that. But in the Globe Theatre as well, it's so like theatrical, and it almost is, you know, like the political goings on in Númenor, especially as we go into season two. This almost is like a stage for Pharazôn to take. So I think that's a really interesting thing for him to compare it to.
100%. And I think, you think back to season one, the speech Pharazôn gives on the steps of the Builders Guild and how he kind of used his rhetoric skills to whip up the crowd. I think we are going to see that turned up to 11 in season two. I think it's very deliberate that Tristan here is talking about, playing to the crowd, take the bull by the horns. I might have heard some things about the Númenor plot in season two and what Pharazôn's going to be doing. And I think it's very telling. He talks about using the royal court like a stage and embracing the fact you're surrounded by an audience. And, it's very telling. I think one of the other interesting things we got about the sets was that Patrick McKay said in Númenor, we're doing the old quarter of the capital city in Númenor and really going into the ethos of the faithful and starting to set up what people who love the mythology know is a civil war and a battle of ideologies. What does their faith mean to them? What did old Númenor mean to these people versus what does it mean to the more Pharazôn folks? And so what I love about that is just perfect and great to hear. We're going to be getting into the Kingsmen faithful divide, which book readers will be familiar with, but even more so and the show is like this about everything, and we praised it at the start, but they're not just telling the story, they're telling the story through the set design, through the costumes, through the props. So the fact that they've even built a new part of the Númenor set specifically to allow them to tap into this part of the story is just, chef's kiss, beautiful.
It's as you said, they've always been good with the visual storytelling. They're not just showing it through the acting, they're showing it physically. Like, we'll be able to see the old Númenor and the differences between this new Pharazôn-esque Númenor. And I think that it'll just be incredible. I mean, I don't really have much else to say on the Númenor set design other than I genuinely don't know how they can improve it from season one, because it like took my breath away, every single aspect of Númenor. So I'm so excited just to see it again, because that's one thing we've not really had a glimpse of, apart from, I think, Miriel's father's tomb. We've not had these kind of wide shots of Númenor that we did get a kind of tease of before season one. So, oh God, we know they're going to be breathtaking anyway.
Yeah, and we didn't get too much more on the costumes either. Obviously, I talked about the costume designer Luca Mosca's point about Miriel and Galadriel's dresses. Cynthia Adai Robinson adds her own praise for Luca's costuming, saying that he's continuing Kate Hawley's original costume designs and building on them. And she says, "I continue to have epic, amazing costumes," which we've already seen a couple of them in the trailer and in the picture of her in her father's tomb. So I'm excited to see that. My favorite quote about hair and makeup is where Flora Moody, who's hair and makeup designer, talks about Tristan Gravel and says, "Tristan likes his eyebrows, and we shaped up his beard and gave him a sort of 300 Persian-esque beard, a bit stronger. In this season, his character has become a bit more powerful." And I like the fact that, obviously they've done stuff with his hair, they've done stuff with his beard, but those killer eyebrows, that's all Tristan.
Yeah, one more thing I'll say actually on the hair and makeup is I know we don't have too much to say on Kemen as a character because, let's be honest, he did not do much in season one, But the one thing we can all celebrate in season 2 is that he's got a new haircut.
Yay!
But yeah, that's like probably the first thing I noticed in that picture. I was like, oh, his strange haircut's gone. I wonder what happened between the end of season 1 and the start of season 2 that made him have this kind of realization. He had the hairstyle blindness. It's happened to all of us.
And let's talk about that picture, because we basically get this wonderful picture of Tristan Gravel as Pharazôn and Leon Wadham as Kemen, his son, in the throne room. Now, throne room, as they say, it's been expanded a little bit. Interestingly, you see some flags in the background, so maybe perhaps representing the way Númenor's presenting itself. But the real teller is in Pharazôn and Kemen's costume. Pharazôn's costume, it's not the same as in the trailer, but it does incorporate that very rich red color, but it also incorporates kind of metallic gold and silver. He's holding something that some people say could be a scepter, as in the scepter of Númenor, which was given to the rulers of Númenor. Not a very impressive scepter, if you ask me, but could be. But his costume continues to incorporate the guild crests, because obviously that was a big part of his costume in season 1. And what's interesting is Kemen's costume almost looks like he's trying to mimic his father's costumes, like in some of the spiral designs on the cloak and the collar. It's very interesting the way you can still see Kemen almost trying to live up to his father's image through the costuming.
Yeah, and I mean, Pharazôn's costumes in season 1 were quite grand anyway. I think they've always been like that, but there's clearly a step up in extravagance here. And I think even from the perspective of him just presenting himself in that role of a leader, I mean, he's clearly playing games here. And I think Kemen, whilst playing into that with him, that if you take them and as like just this picture without context, they look like they could be the kings, the rulers of Númenor. It's they're very much presenting themselves like that for a reason.
Yeah. One thing that people have picked up on Twitter is the fact that Kemen's sleeves are the one bit which breaks from the color pattern of Pharazôn's kind of red and gold. And they're this kind of, is it blue? Is it green? And this started a little bit of a debate on Twitter where, is this showing that Kemen might still go towards the faithful because blue we've associated with the faithful? Or is it closer to the green we've seen in Eärion's new dress? And so it's showing his ties to her. And I love that already we've got one picture of Kemen and we're going, which way is he going to go? And what do the color of his sleeves mean?
That's the one. That's something that I do love about the Tolkien community is just the absolute insanity, because you give us a picture where there's one thing that doesn't match with everything else and we will theorize about it with like 5 different avenues of things that it could mean.
Exactly. And we are going to return to Míriel, but just while we're talking about Pharazôn, let's talk about some of the quotes we get about him from Tristan, because I think they're very interesting. Tristan talks about Pharazôn having his own vision for Númenor, and he's talking about being utilitarian. And the most interesting bit, he says, and I think somebody like Pharazôn realizes that because it's not all sunshine and rainbows, you do have to sometimes practice the dark arts, but you're just being very functional and practical for the good of the people. I mean, gosh, we've never heard a ruler or a leader talk about, doing bad things for the good of the people. And it's just the practical option. It's just the functional option. I mean, for those who've read the books, they know exactly where this is going, but this is some pretty clear signposting about Pharazôn's approach to the delicate power balance in Númenor following Míriel's return.
See, something that I picked up on, one thing actually was that Tristan said he'd been kind of doing research on political theory and reading up on people like Henry Kissinger and Charles de Gaulle, which is just, we already know how committed the actors are, but to have that kind of real kind of him going into that political background is great. But one thing that I noticed between himself and Cynthia is that they touched on Pharazôn's and Míriel's reactions to Míriel's blindness. And what that made me think of is, I won't talk about this too much because it's something that we've actually talked about quite a lot, is that for people who know the story of the Silmarillion and know what happens within Númenor, the way Pharazôn usurps power is by kind of having this forced marriage with Míriel. But I'm taking this because I'm, me and you, we both don't want that to be the way that they go. And we've said before, there's many other ways that they could go about him taking that power. And he actually says that Pharazôn and kind of the wider people of Númenor see Míriel's blindness is an embarrassment. Metaphorically and physically, their leader has lost her sight. So in that vein, I don't think it would make sense from Pharazôn's perspective for him to get closer to Miriel, to marry himself to her and be tied to that image of quote unquote blindness. So I'm taking that as my hope that they'll go down a different route and he'll in fact just distance himself and just present himself as a more forward and practical leader who has vision, metaphorically and physically,
Yeah, there's a huge thing in these, and I highly recommend reading all the articles which contain quotes from Tristan and Cynthia, because we're not going to be able to cover every quote, and they are so interesting. But Cynthia talks about the idea of people in Númenor being corrupted in a quest to gobble up power, whereas Tristan talks about the idea of a cleaning up of the image of Númenor, of what's happened. So it's all about perception, this idea that the way Miriel and the faithful see the perception of Númenor and the image of Númenor, and the way Pharazôn sees it. And Pharazôn sees it as needing to change. And again, it's this idea of, do the ends justify the means? A utilitarian view. As you said, as part of that research, he read a book called Walls, which is about, as he described it, it's a book called Walls by David Fry. And to quote Greville, he says, it was about people who lived inside walls and then the so-called barbarians on the outside. And there's definitely a different perspective of how they're seen and how they see the world. So when you build these walls, your reputation inside those counts for nothing in the outside world. And so it's up to you to build that again. And there comes a fear, I think, and there's a lot to lose. And so it's the height that you fall from is greater. I mean, for those who know the story of Númenor, they know where this is going. But again, image, perception, reputation. What does Pharazôn want to do? He thinks that Númenor, after its failure in Middle-earth, its reputation has been damaged. And outside the walls of Númenor, it's not feared. And what Pharazôn wants to do is put Númenor back in a position where it is perceived as strong, whereas it is something to be feared. And in doing so, he is going to build Númenor up to a great height. But as he says, from a greater height, greater the fall.
Yeah, and I think that what we'll find actually is, because, we as Silmarillion and kind of the wider Legendarium readers, we have this perception of Pharazôn already. We know exactly what he's going to do. We don't know how it's going to play out exactly in the Rings of Power, but we have this preconception of his character. So we see him and we don't like him. However, Tristan is a very charismatic man. We saw that in season 1. And I think that they'll really lean into that in season 2. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if some of the audience find themselves kind of at first sympathizing with him and agreeing with him, because that's sort of Pharazôn's power, is his ability to get people on his side and persuade people. And I don't think that they're going to completely, at least at first, show that from a villainous perspective. As sympathizers with Miriel, we're going to see it that way. But a lot of what he's saying is going to make sense. He's not speaking from this entirely selfish perspective. And Tristan's made it clear that he wants to clean up Númenor, quote unquote. And his intentions at first, he wants power, but what he's saying is going to make sense at first, I think. And I think that's how he gets people. It's almost similar to Sauron. He goes in, he kind of dips his foot in, grabs people with something that he knows they want, and then once he has them, that's when he kind of goes and grabs it. And if there's one thing we know about Pharazôn, is that he's not afraid to reach for the stars to get for what he wants.
And I think, obviously, I have some inside information about how the Númenor plotline is going to play out, and I haven't released most of it because I don't think that's good. But what I will say to people is read these interviews and then think about what you've seen in the trailer and the behind-the-scenes video. You've seen a shot of Miriel walking into the throne room wearing a white dress that, very similar to her father's ruling robe. So is that something to do with her trying to succeed her father? We've seen the eagle fly into the court of Númenor, and we've seen Pharazôn bear his sword at it and kind of seem to almost defy the eagle. We've seen a shot of Elendil in a crowd that's kind of looks like there's almost a mosh pit, a riot going on. And obviously we can talk about the new Elendil picture in a second, but think about how that's all playing together and what what Tristan's talked about in terms of using the court like a stage. They're giving us the seeds already of, like you say, probably not going down the forced marriage route, but probably going down the route of how is Númenor seen? What do people think of Miriel? What do they think of the expedition? And what can Pharazôn, offer a different perspective? Let's just touch on some of the quotes Cynthia gives us. There's a really long interview, which I'll link in the show notes, so we're not going to cover everything. But she says some really interesting stuff. She says, Miriel, specifically within Númenor, when we last leave her, she is not only blind, but she's returning to Númenor in defeat. The political ramifications and the divisions in society that we started to see in Season 1 are only exacerbated in Season 2. And Númenorian society reaction to all the events from Season 1 and the essentially losing battle that occurred and people's feelings around that. And she also mentions the visions within the Palantir and how other people view the elves as the kind of magic of the elves, the witchcraft, the idea of it being something foreign and dangerous. And you can very much see how we're going to go straight into Númenor in Season 2, basically being on a knife edge.
Yeah, I think the interview with Cynthia is really good. It is very long, but she covers so much about Miriel's story. And I touched on this slightly before, but I really like that she didn't shy away from discussing Miriel's blindness. Because we wondered at the end of Season 1 whether it would be a temporary thing or something that would continue as they go into Season 2. And, from Pharazôn and some of the King's Men, this is a weakness. She has literally and metaphorically lost her vision. She's kind of led these armies of Númenor to destruction. There's probably not a lot of them that returned from the expedition. So she's arriving back to Númenor with this failure, but she's also arriving back to the death of her father. And I'm going to touch really quickly on the picture we got of her, because we got kind of a close-up of her in her father's tomb. And I don't think that there's too much to discuss, but something that really struck me is that she's obviously lost her vision, so she can't see. And we see her kind of touching the impression of her father's face to kind of, that's her way of seeing him. And I thought that was really, really sad. And I can imagine that scene's going to be quite poignant. And I like that because it was Eärien was one of the people who went in to get the impression. I believe that was part of her role. And I think that Cynthia makes it very clear that she doesn't view Miriel's blindness as a weakness in any sort. She says, I never viewed it as a weakness or something that was going to be debilitating. Miriel is starting from the second season in a place of great loss. So she acknowledges that she's starting with this loss, but it's something that can almost strengthen her. And she talks about kind of how the blindness heightens the rest of her senses. And she also talks about how Elendil takes on this role as not just her protector, but her eyes and her ears. And I guess we can talk about that a bit more with Elendil, but that is one of the kind of only pieces of information we get about him. But I think we're going to see a lot more of an intimate relationship between the two. And I don't necessarily mean romantic, because I know some people think that that's where it's going to go. But I think it will be more intimate. He is her eyes, basically.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that quote's great, and she follows it up by saying, and she's talking about her blindness here, and she says, I wanted to continue to make sure that it wasn't going to come across in any way that felt weak or diminishing, that this was about tapping into the strength of the character who, despite this setback, still has the qualities of leadership and the desire to lead her people, and is going to have to do it through this challenging situation. And I love that, because the one thing we don't want is, like in the books, that basically Pharazôn forces her to marry him, and then she has no power, no influence, no fight in her.
Yeah.
This is so important that even if we know that Pharazôn is starting from an advantageous position, and we obviously, for those of us who've read the books, we know where it goes, the important point is that Miriel is still going to have that fight in her. And like you say, she's going to have this close relationship with Elendil. And it's that almost, she says here that basically they're going to teach each other different things. And I think he's going to be teaching her about certain ideas of resilience and leadership in different senses that he will have had through the Sea Guard. And she is going to be teaching him about leadership through things like being faithful and the idea of doing things for the greater good and the higher power. And so I love that idea that it is it's not a one-sided relationship that they're going to have. It's going to be they can both give each other different things. Do we want to talk about Elendil? Because like we said, there's a really long interview with Miriel, so we can't cover everything. But should we talk about the one thing we got about Elendil?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so the one thing we got of Elendil is a picture of Elendil in what looks like a dungeon of some kind. He's lying on the floor. He's just wearing a simple tunic and his leggings and boots. And standing across for him is what looks like Eärien. Difficult to tell in the lighting, but the hair looks very similar. The cloak is very kind of rich blue that we might associate with Elendil's family. And just from what we can see, I think this is Eärien visiting Elendil in a dungeon, which we have subtitled as Elendil in Chains, and Anna has subtitled as Yummy. So, Anna, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the album Elendil in Chains?
So I'm going to start this off with a little behind-the-scenes fact. It is about a year ago now. Myself and Harry met up in Manchester, and we went to kind of a Lord of the Rings orchestra-y, concert-y, candlelight thing. It was really nice, and they actually played some of the Rings of Power music as well. So during that little trip, Harry gave me one of his Númenor leaks. And listen, Harry is very good with the leaks. He doesn't kind of just go out and give them all away. However, he knew that this one would be very, very dear to me. And he told me, I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said something like, "You are going to see Elendil handcuffed, in chains, being kind of dragged away at some point in this season." And oh my goodness, I don't consider myself a very good secret keeper, but it has been painful to keep that in until now. And Harry, I hope that you're happy with me, because the amount of times I've wanted to talk about that has been insane. And now we can, because we can see it. He's in chains.
It's very exciting.
And technically, I shouldn't be happy about it, because he's clearly not having a good time, but he just looks so good.
Yeah, exactly. The more distressed, the more worn down, the more beaten he looks. And I should say as well that, yes, you did an excellent job of keeping the secret, and I appreciate that. And as Anna said, I did like 3 separate sets of leaks on Twitter, and they were mostly costume stuff, a little bit of plot stuff, but not really some behind the scenes on the filming. But the reason I stayed away from this stuff was because what I really didn't want to do was spoil this if this was something. And it's like the eagle. I'd heard about the eagle arriving in the court, and I know a lot more about what happens in that scene, which I'm not going to talk about, obviously. But I'd heard about that at the same time. I'd heard about Elendil ended up being imprisoned, and I know what might happen with Elendil after this, which is even, I can promise you guys, if you're excited by seeing Elendil in Chains, what will follow is even juicier. But I think it was something I didn't want to talk about publicly, because I wanted the show, if they chose to hide it until the season came out. Obviously, they've decided to put it in the promo material, which I think is very telling. They're really showing that Elendil's going through it this season. And the fact it's been released along with all these interviews about Númenor and strife, the divide between the faithful and the Kingsmen, the divide between Miriel and Pharazôn, Elendil and Miriel relying on each other. Well, Elendil's ending up in prison, so she's not going to be relying on him then. But also, is it going to be working with Miriel that leads him to end up in the dungeon? A lot to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the inside scoops like Harry does, but my kind of take from this was that, you know, we've had very little of Elendil. Like, please give us some more. But from what we do have of him, we have that shot of him in what looks to be kind of amidst a riot in the Númenorian courthouse, and we can see him reaching towards someone who we can assume is Miriel. So I want to see that is the kind of precursor to him ending up in the dungeon or wherever he is. It seems like there's this big kind of outbreak of violence, and whether that's the kind of defining moment between the Kingsmen and the faithful, and he gets kind of imprisoned for that, I'm not sure. But I think it is really interesting, especially as you get into this kind of perspective of Miriel really relying on him to be her eyes and ears. The fact that they are splitting them up and isolating them is interesting, because I feel like maybe Pharazôn can see them giving each other strength, and, you know, he doesn't want that. He wants Miriel to be in this position of isolation and weakness. And listen, Elendil, I don't think anyone really in Númenor is going to have a good time this season.
No, and I think it's very telling as well that Eärien is visiting him in prison. She's clearly not imprisoned as well.
Yes.
And we've seen other shots of her wearing new clothes, perhaps standing close to Pharazôn in the behind-the-scenes video of the scene where Elendil and Miriel are on the coast at that kind of, on the cliffs. Who knows when that's going to occur in relation to this image? Who could possibly say? I've seen some people speculating that Elendil is going to, they're going to take him for execution. I mean, obviously we know Elendil isn't getting executed, because otherwise he's never getting to the Battle of the Last Alliance. But it is interesting to think about, after he's imprisoned, what happens next? How might Pharazôn deal with someone who is a very prominent figure? Remember, a senior captain in the Sea Guard, a bit of almost a consort or personal guard to Miriel. So if it's Pharazôn behind this and behind imprisoning him, he's probably going to have to be careful about what he does with Elendil and how he handles it. So again, just more things to think about there. But yes, I think we'll leave it by saying Elendil in chains, very yummy and very interesting to think about.
Very yummy. And I think the only other thing I have to add is going back to Círdan. For anyone who hasn't seen Ben Daniels in kind of any of his other roles, the one thing I will say is he is probably the only person who can rival Lloyd's like chocolatey, deep Elendil voice. So they're going to have kind of a voice off this season, I think.
That's important. So we'll leave it there for Elendil. And
Yes.
and the last piece of news we're going to cover, and we're going to cover this in 10 minutes probably, because we've got to finish up, because again, somehow we're approaching the 4-hour mark. We'll really try and edit this one down, I promise. But the last bit of information we got across these articles was on Rhûn and the Stranger's Journey. Obviously something they've been keeping quite close to their chest. We still don't really know a lot of what's going to be happening there. Very little promo footage from there, except that, obviously they filmed this in the Canary Islands. They made it look like a very desert and arid environment. So I'll start with the quote from Patrick McKay about exploring Rhûn. He says, "We've never seen deserts on screen in Middle-earth, and we're really excited to go there. We think deserts are beautiful and awesome, and we're doing our own Tolkienian Lawrence of Arabia." Not sure how I feel about that quote, but there we go. One of the things that's been fun about Rhûn is it's really a blank canvas. There are little hints. There's talk about magic cults and stars being strange and rumours of wizards having adventures in Rhûn that may or may not have gone well. And so they say they're drawing on all of these. And he says it's been really fun trying to imagine what world, what the people in it are like, what the architecture is like, what kind of desert. We just spent 5 weeks shooting in a far-flung overseas location for spectacular vistas, and it's really cool. So what I'll say about this: positives, sounds like they've put a lot of thought into what they want to do with Rhûn. Negatives, we talked about this on the last episode. This does make me think more and more again, we're not going to get into a part of Rhûn where there's cities and a bit. I mean, they talk about architecture, but it doesn't feel to me like they've. I don't know, maybe I'm going too far, but I'm starting to come more towards the idea I had on our last episode that the journey in Rhûn is really only going to be kind of scratching the surface, and we're going to have to wait till season 3 to meet the men of Rhûn and the, culture.
I agree. I mean, I think they've talked so much about set design in the past few articles that I think if they had done some kind of grand kind of architecture for the cities and kind of buildings and stuff like that, they probably would have mentioned it here. They could just be kind of holding out, but I'm not sure. I think from this kind of Rhûn article, the biggest part that stuck out to me was when they said that they want to hopefully tell a story that feels worthy of the other canonical stories in here. And I think that this kind of relates to our worry that this is the storyline that won't intermingle with any of the other main storylines in season 2. Just as it didn't in season 1, the Harfoots were very far removed from the rest of them. It does make me wonder that, we know that they're very kind of open to fan feedback now. I wonder if they did see the criticisms of the Harfoots feeling, and this isn't myself because I liked the Harfoot storyline, but a lot of people felt that it was quite irrelevant in season 1 just because it didn't have that tie into anything else. So it's good that I think they're aware of it. However, the fact that they want to tell a story that feels worthy of the other canonical stories just leads me more into that aspect of it's still going to be completely removed from the rest of them, It's going to be its own kind of thing. And it's just how they'll kind of tie that relevance to the bigger story, because I feel like what they're at risk of happening here is there's so much going on, Khazad-dûm, the forging of the 7 rings, there's Annatar and Celebrimbor, you have Galadriel, Círdan, everyone like that. that all of that is so kind of dramatic and tumultuous, and there's so much going on. They run the risk of kind of cutting back to the Stranger and Tom Bombadil and the Harfoots and having the audience almost kind of have this like, oh, why?
Yeah.
I think that's the big question is why do we have this storyline included? And I think it's how they're going to answer that.
And we'll get onto some of the quotes they make about the Stranger's identity in a second, but I want to just touch on the bit which kind of links these two, which is going from talking about Rhûn to talking about the Stranger's journey. And JD Payne says, for us, what's always kept it grounded is going through the experience the characters themselves are having, and the wizard doesn't know who they are. If they did, then it might be a little cheap, because it would just be like we're withholding just for the purpose of withholding. But the wizard is on a journey of self-discovery. He learned a couple of things about himself at the end of season 1. He learned that he's an Astari and that he has a destiny in the east to go and seek out. So now we are on that journey of self-discovery with him, when he's learning to control his powers. So again, positive. I like that the reason they're keeping his identity a mystery is not just because it's a mystery box. They're very clearly doing it because it's a way of exploring what a character who doesn't know who they are goes through, and how that fits into Middle-earth and the ideas of destiny and fate and purpose. Negative, it still sounds like season 2 for the Stranger and Nori and Rhûn is just a journey of self-discovery, especially where it's like learning how to control his powers. I'm going to be really harsh. I don't care. I really don't care about a wizard learning how to use his powers. Like, it's just so, it's such a tired fantasy trope that I just don't care. And so it goes back to your point. This needs to connect to Sauron, and I think it will in future. I genuinely think Rhûn, Sauron, the Stranger, it's all going to connect. They've talked about the Stranger and Sauron being on a collision course. But season 2, I'm going into season 2 very cautious about the Stranger's storyline. And this is the one bit of the news that, as you said at the start, most of it's made us feel very optimistic. This is the one bit that hasn't changed my view.
I mean, I think it's like you said, I think I would, because if this is Gandalf, which I'm hoping it is, they don't do another bait and switch, but it's nice to see his origins. It's nice to see him kind of learning who he is and come about that. However, when you have that as the back burner to Celebrimbor and Annatar forging the rings, it's like how it just kind of pales in comparison, and that might just be my perspective, because I kind of find one storyline more interesting than the others, but it is kind of getting the audience to care about it. One thing that made me laugh reading this, and this could just be kind of a pitfall of how the article was written, but they make this big thing about how they don't want everything to be a mystery box and a puzzle, and that's not what they want to go for in this season. And then almost immediately after that, they go into this thing where they end it with, could it also mean that the Stranger is Saruman? I was like, no, please no.
To give the context of what Anne's talking about, there's a quote where they're talking about, the idea of Stranger's identity not being a puzzle, and they say, despite what folks might think, we're really not about a game. We're really not about a puzzle, but we also don't want to take for granted where characters will end up. We want to see them grow and change along the way, and we hope that in the end, you look back and it feels inevitable. But in the moment, I'm trying to say it, but not say it. And then he goes on to say, could that mean the Stranger is Gandalf? And that he says, some of the dialogue we heard in season 1, and then he'll say that later on, like, always follow your nose. And he says, it could definitely mean that. Could it also mean that the Stranger is Saruman? And you realise that later on, Saruman said that to Gandalf, and then Gandalf said it. So we like to keep these doors open. It's fun to engage with the story and think of the possibilities. Now, I'm going to give my most sympathetic reading of this. They are entertaining the fact people like making fan theories about this. We know from what they've said, they read all the fan theories. And for example, the bit about Saruman, I have seen people say, I've seen fans say, I've seen podcasts and content creators say, I've seen it. But the thing that I think is most telling is in that first quote where they say, we want to see them grow and change along the way and hope in the end you look back and it feels inevitable. So it's Gandalf as far as I'm concerned, because otherwise it's not inevitable. Otherwise, it's just taking the mick out of the audience for the sake of it and go, oh, you thought because he had a line of Gandalf's dialogue, that meant he was Gandalf. Oh, you fool, you idiot viewer. So I think this is JD Payne and Patrick McKay being a bit cheeky and saying, we want to let viewers have fun and make theories and stuff like that. But when you look back, it should feel inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, this is probably my least anticipated storyline. I think I'm very much in that ballpark with you. I think Tom Bombadil is the saving grace because I'm just incredibly excited to see him adapted. I think that I would be more excited if I knew that we were fully exploring Rhûn, but again, I don't think that we will. I think we'll stay very much on the outskirts. And Tom Bombadil will be, you know, a 1-2 episode pit stop on their journey to Rhûn. So it's just kind of, I think they'll have to put a lot of effort into kind of holding the audience attention and making this storyline feel worthwhile, because eventually it will. I'm kind of in the same park as you, where I think in season 3 we'll get the creation of the Nine Rings and Sauron will go to Rhûn, and that's when we'll kind of fully go into the city and see the civilization realized. So if that's the case, then it's fine, but it's going to be very hard to hold people's attention as Nori and Poppy and the Stranger just kind of travel through a desert for a few episodes, you know, with them maybe the mystics on their tail. Feels very similar to what we had from them in season 1, just in a different location, you know? Anyway, sorry, negativity over. I'm sure it'll be fine.
I think it's fair for us to say, and I know some people say we got to wait and see. And guys, we are going to wait and see, and we're being open to it. But we also want to be honest with you, where some things have us less excited. And for me, this is just something where I think I was probably more excited about Rhûn before they started talking about it, and now I'm like a bit worried about Rhûn this season and Strange Journey. But we got to remember, we'll probably go see the Return of the Mystics. We might see some cool stuff there. We might get into more of the magical element of it. So let's wait and see. But I'm with Anna here. It's going to be something that I'm going to need to be whereas other storylines, I'm ready to be won over and I'm already excited. This is one where they're going to have to win me over, and that's not their problem. That's my own problem. But we'll see. Right, well, that takes us through, guys, I promise you this is 42 pages of notes on articles. It took a whole day's worth of research and prep yesterday from Anna, so we do apologise. This has been another long episode, but we really hope you enjoyed all the stuff about Círdan, about Númenor, about Sauron, all the theory crafting and pictures. I mean, the promo machine has really got up to speed now, and like I said, we're closing in on Comic-Con, we're closing in on more trailers, and it's only going to get better from here. Anna, any final thoughts on what we've talked about today and just this overall experience we're going through?
I mean, a big thank you to anyone who's listened to another probably 3 hours of us talking about the promo. It's been really nice to get to discuss all the behind the scenes aspects, I think, because it's not something that we've really touched on this heavily in detail before. So it's been really nice to touch on that and just hear kind of the thoughts from the showrunners and the VFX, prosthetics, hair and makeup departments. You know, I think for a lot of shows, it's not something that really gets that spotlight. So it was nice to talk about that. And obviously the main man, Círdan, I'm still just like, I still haven't really fully wrapped my head around that news, but yeah, I think that has been the highlight to me, and I'm wondering if we'll get anything between now and the trailer. I mean, if we do, it'll probably just be more articles, more pictures, but a trailer incoming, I think, very soon, and I'm just very excited, and I hope that we get more Elendil because we're starving over here. We're starving.
Absolutely, and I couldn't echo more on the Círdan point. We could have spent 2 hours just talking about Círdan, but guess what? We're going to see him in the shows, and we're going to get to hear Ben Daniels talk about him. So we've got plenty to look forward to. And yeah, guys, once again, if any single person, I know most people won't listen all the way through, but even if just one person has listened all the way through another one of these marathon episodes, thank you so much. And of course, a big thank you to Anna for once again, not only the 3-4 hours we've spent talking today, but also helping out, going through all the prep work with me, reading all the articles. Anna, as always, I owe a massive debt of gratitude to you, and as always, it's been great fun.
Thank you for having me on. And for anyone who is still listening, I'm just going to pop one more little anecdote in here. And it's that Harry rang me up yesterday and said, you know, I'm about to send this document full of information over to you. It's 28 pages long. And I was like, Jesus Christ. Okay, that's fine. I'll read through it. A few hours later, he said, okay, I've cut the document down quite a lot. Go in, see what you think. So I click into the document, and what do I see? It's now 38 pages long. I'm like, Harry, what the hell have you been doing? You've added 10 pages and told me that you've cut it down.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember what the Winston Churchill quote is. It's something like, "I'm sorry for sending you a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one." And I think that's basically how I go through life. If I stopped and thought before doing things, I could probably get things done quicker. But instead, I just go in like a bull in a china shop. And yeah, so listen, if anyone wants to know what it's like doing a podcast with me, not that fun actually. But like Anna said, we got through it. We're here today. And we're now going to finish recording because we're both about to get ready to go and watch England in the Euros. So come on, England, bring it home.
This is the only time I'll ever feel patriotic in my life.
Exactly. Sporting events are my exception for where I'm going to feel patriotic. And listen, after a week of Círdan, Rings of Power news, if we end it with England bringing home the Euros, then it will have been a good week. And with that, we'll head to the outro. And that, dear listeners, is the end of today's discussion with Anna. I think it now goes without saying that I am shocked and awed that any of you are able to endure, or perhaps even enjoy, these marathon episodes. I promise that this time, Anna and I really were planning to make this a more concise episode. We failed at that, but regardless, I know some of you prefer these extended conversations, in which case, our failure can be a gift to you. As with last week, we're still receiving a huge amount of news on an almost daily basis. If only someone had once invented a daily Rings of Power podcast. All the same, in just the time between Anna and I recording this episode on Sunday and now, we've had more articles, another new cast member's role revealed, and even some cool new wallpapers released. I haven't decided yet whether we'll do an episode this week, perhaps a short bumper episode at the weekend to recap any news we missed, but if not, we'll be back soon as Comic-Con is just over a week away. If you're somehow new to this podcast, make sure you subscribe on whichever podcast platform you prefer, so that you never miss an episode. And as a small piece of additional admin, I just wanted to let listeners know that all the episodes of the Daily Rings of Power podcast are now on YouTube, so if you prefer to listen to your podcast episodes there, or even just want to catch up on our library of the past 36 episodes, head on over to Daily Rings of Power on YouTube. As always, I would love to continue the discussion, whether that's on Twitter or now as well in the comments section of our YouTube videos. But for today, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back very soon with more discussion of the latest news on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.